So settle in, get comfortable, maybe pull the blanket up a little, find your spot, let your body sink into whatever you're resting on right now. We're going to spend the next couple of hours just drifting through some of the most wild, chaotic, surprisingly emotional, and deeply entertaining storylines that Family Guy ever produced. There's a lot of ground to cover, and we're going to take our time with every single one of them. This isn't a review, this isn't a ranking. This is just a long, slow, comfortable walkthrough over 2 decades worth of animated insanity from the very first night Peter Griffin stumbled home from a stag party with 37 beers in his system, all the way through giant chicken fights, time machine disasters, road trips across dimensions, emotional bank vault confessions, and everything in between. We're going to let it all wash over us, slow and easy, like a long story told by someone who has no reason to rush. So close your eyes if you want to, or don't. Either way, just breathe, relax, and let's go back to a little fictional town on the Rhode Island coast, where the most gloriously dysfunctional family in animated history has been causing trouble since January of 1999. Section 1. The very beginning death has a shadow and the world that started it all. There's something worth understanding about how Family Guy actually came to exist before we get into the stories themselves, because the origin of the show is almost as strange and unlikely as the show itself. Seth MacFarlane was a young animator who had studied at the Rhode Island School of Design, which is a detail that matters more than it might seem at first. He wasn't somebody who stumbled into animation from nowhere. He trained for it. He studied character design and storytelling and visual language, and while he was still a student, he made a pair of short animated films called The Life of Larry and Larry and Steve. If you've ever seen those shorts, and they're not particularly hard to find, you can immediately clock that the big, round-faced, slightly dim but fundamentally well-meaning Larry is basically a prototype of Peter Griffin, and the dry, sardonic, world-weary dog named Steve is clearly the DNA that Brian Griffin would eventually grow from. MacFarlane had these two characters rattling around in his head even before he knew what to do with them. After graduating, he went to work at Hanna-Barbera, where he did work on shows like Johnny Bravo, Cow and Chicken, and Dexter's Laboratory. He was 22, 23 years old, learning the mechanics of professional animation production, while these other character ideas kept developing somewhere in the background. And eventually he took everything he'd been thinking about, built a full family around those two prototype characters, and pitched a 15-minute pilot to Fox in May of 1998. Fox, to their credit, recognized something immediately. They gave him the green light. And on the 31st of January 1999, right after Super Bowl 33, Family Guy debuted to approximately 22 million viewers. 22 million people. That number is staggering when you hold it next to where the show eventually ended up, but in that moment, it was proof that what MacFarlane had made was something people were genuinely excited about. The Super Bowl lead-in helped enormously. Of course, any show airing after the Super Bowl is going to get a massive audience, simply because millions of people are already sitting on their couches with the television on. But even accounting for that boost, 22 million people watching the very first episode of a new animated comedy was a serious number. It said something. That first episode was called Death Has a Shadow, a title that sounds far more ominous than the actual episode turned out to be. It was Seth MacFarlane writing solo on this one, directing through Peter Shin, and the entire story kicks off because Peter Griffin did exactly what you'd expect Peter Griffin to do. He went to a stag party, drank 37 cans of beer, a number specific enough to suggest it wasn't chosen randomly, came home and fell asleep at his job at the Happy-Go-Lucky toy factory, and allowed a batch of genuinely dangerous products to make it out the door and onto store shelves. The things that slip past Peter's unconscious supervision in this episode are a perfect window into the absurdist sensibility that MacFarlane was building the show around. A box of Pound Poochies, which is meant to contain a soft plush dog toy, instead contains a bottle of prescription pills. A silly ball turns out to be a throwing hatchet. A girl's baby doll comes equipped with what the show casually describes as a flamethrower. These aren't accidents in the conventional sense. They're the products of a man who fell asleep at the exact moment quality control required his attention, and the resulting chaos is played completely straight by the world of the show, which makes it funnier. Peter loses his job at the factory because of this. Mr. Weed, his boss, fires him on the spot. And this is where the episode's central plot kicks in. Because rather than going home and telling Lois the truth about what happened, Peter signs up for welfare. He fills out the form, submits it, and then discovers that due to some clerical error that the show never bothers to explain, he has been approved for a welfare check that is considerably larger than it should be. We're talking about a check that would allow him to hire a personal jester, and yes, the jester he hires turns out to be Jerry Seinfeld, and throw parties, and generally live a lifestyle that a recently unemployed toy factory worker has absolutely no business living. The welfare money rains down on Peter like something out of a dream, and he does what any Peter Griffin would do with an unexpected windfall. He spends it on himself, on entertainment, on whatever catches his eye in the moment, and he keeps right on not telling Lois that he's been unemployed this entire time. Meanwhile, in the background of all of this, Stewie Griffin is pursuing his own completely separate agenda. And this is where the episode introduces one of the most important things about early Stewie, which is the concept of the mind control device. Stewie, in this very first episode, has built a mind control device. He's put the finishing touches on it. He's sitting at the dinner table with it, ready to deploy it in whatever villainous scheme he's working on. And Lois takes it away from him because she sees it as a toy, and toys are not allowed at the dinner table. She confiscates it with the completely casual energy of a mother who has no idea she just disarmed her infant son's weapon of mass psychological manipulation. The joke is perfect because it works on two levels simultaneously. Lois thinks she's doing normal parenting, and she is, but Stewie's frustration at being thwarted is the frustration of an evil genius who has just had his plans derailed by someone who doesn't even know they're doing it. The two plot lines eventually collide in a way that resolves everything in one stroke. Stewie gets his mind control device back from wherever Lois stored it and uses it during Peter's court hearing for welfare fraud, and the resulting mind-controlled crowd provides exactly the character support Peter needs to avoid serious consequences. It's a neat piece of storytelling that demonstrates McFarlane understood, even in the very first episode, how to make two separate stories serve each other. The episode also features one of the earliest cutaway gags in the show's history, and it's worth noting how short and sharp it is. The gag cuts to Adolf Hitler struggling to lift tiny barbells in what appears to be a German gym, while across the room a heavily muscular Jewish man stands with women on each arm, and Hitler's expression shifts from exertion to outrage. That's it. That's the whole gag. It lasts maybe 8 seconds. And then the show cuts right back to the main story. That ratio, a brief, punchy side joke that doesn't interrupt the main narrative for long, is the template for how cutaway gags worked in their original form, before they expanded to fill entire episodes. What Death Has a Shadow really establishes, more than any plot mechanics, is the emotional baseline of the show. Peter and Lois have a marriage that operates on genuine affection even when it's fraying. Peter is capable of doing stupid, reckless, selfish things, but he still has a core of warmth. Brian is there at the edges of the episode, dry and wry and sensible, functioning as the intelligent perspective that Peter consistently ignores. Stewie is building weapons in the house and nobody knows about it. Meg exists. Chris exists. The family is slightly chaotic in all directions, but it feels like a family. And that feeling is what made early Family Guy something worth caring about. The show settled into Rhode Island, into the fictional town that the characters live in, up and down Spooner Street, with the Drunken Clam Bar a short drive away, and Peter's various employers providing a rotating backdrop for his working life, and it immediately had the feeling of a place that actually existed. The geography of the show felt coherent. The relationships between the characters felt earned, or at least clearly set up to be earned over time. This was a world you could sink into. Season 1 ran its 13 episodes, and the show found a devoted audience. It ranked 33rd in the Nielsen ratings for that year, averaging about 12.8 million households tuning in per episode. Not a massive hit by the standards of the biggest network shows, but strong enough to suggest a real following. And then Fox, being Fox, decided to move it around the schedule so relentlessly that the audience couldn't keep track of it long enough to actually stay with it. But we'll get to the cancellation and the resurrection later. For now, the important thing is the world the show built in those early months. A town full of strange people, a family full of even stranger people, and the sense that anything could happen at any moment as long as it was also somehow, beneath all the chaos, kind of sweet. Because that's what people forget about very early Family Guy. It was kind of sweet. Section 2. Peter Griffin's most gloriously unhinged moments. The man, the myth, the menace. Peter Griffin is one of those characters in animated television who exists in a permanent state of almost understandable, almost sympathetic. Almost the kind of person you'd actually want to spend time with. And it's that perpetual almostness that made him, in the show's best years, one of the funniest figures in American comedy. In the early seasons, Peter's particular brand of chaos operated on a very specific frequency. He wasn't malicious. He wasn't calculated. He was a man who moved through life on pure, unexamined impulse, who encountered a situation, formed an immediate and usually incorrect interpretation of it, and then acted on that interpretation with total commitment. He didn't second-guess himself. He didn't slow down to check whether his plan made sense. He just went, with the full energy of someone who is absolutely certain they're doing the right thing even when they are clearly, obviously, catastrophically wrong. This produced some genuinely memorable storylines in the early and middle seasons of the show. There's the time Peter discovers he might be Jewish, which sends him on a full-scale identity overhaul. The episode, called When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, comes from Season 2 and has Peter receiving what he considers to be a revelation after meeting and being charmed by a Jewish accountant who helps him manage his finances, something Peter has been disastrously bad at. Peter becomes convinced that what he and his family need is someone with Jewish heritage in the household, because in Peter's mind, Rakud with money are the same thing, a conflation the episode is actually using to make a point about stereotyping rather than endorsing. He becomes so fixated on this idea that he decides to have Chris converted to Judaism. He takes his son to Las Vegas to find a rabbi. The trip goes exactly as any trip Peter and Chris take would go, a complete detour from sanity. The episode was actually one of the ones Fox initially refused to air. It sat on the shelf before eventually finding its broadcast home, and it's still considered one of the most genuinely thoughtful episodes of the early seasons, using Peter's obliviousness as the mechanism for a story about how stereotypes work and why they're reductive even when they seem positive. There's also the episode where Peter discovers his family might have a black ancestor, which is called Peter's Black Friend in some territories and aired during Season 4. Peter becomes intensely interested in what this means for his identity, and the show uses his clueless enthusiasm as a way to examine how white people sometimes perform allyship in ways that are more about themselves than about the people they're supposedly supporting. These kinds of episodes showed that the show, when it wanted to, could use Peter's particular kind of stupidity to say something actually meaningful about the world. But let's be honest. The episodes most people remember aren't the ones where Peter learns a lesson about cultural sensitivity. They're the ones where Peter gets into a fight with a giant chicken. The giant chicken Ernie, as the show eventually establishes his name to be, is one of the most perfectly absurdist recurring concepts in all of animated television, and the story of how the feud started is almost funnier than the fights themselves. It begins with something as trivial as an expired coupon. Ernie, who is a giant anthropomorphic chicken standing roughly the same height as Peter and dressed in human clothing, gives Peter a coupon. The coupon, when Peter tries to use it, turns out to have expired. Peter is furious. And from that single, genuinely petty grievance, one of the great ongoing rivalries in cartoon history is born. The first of the full-scale chicken fights appears in the Season 4 episode Blind Ambition, which aired in 2005 after the show's return from cancellation. The fight breaks out in the middle of an otherwise completely unrelated scene when Peter spots Ernie across a parking lot or a street or wherever the show happens to have placed them, and everything about their body language says that both of these beings remember exactly who the other one is and exactly what they did. And then they throw themselves at each other with the full commitment of two entities who have decided that this is, without question, the most important conflict currently happening on Earth. What makes the chicken fights so special isn't really the content of any individual fight, though they are extremely entertaining. It's the structure. The fights always begin by derailing whatever scene was actually happening. Peter will be in the middle of a conversation or on his way somewhere or just living his life, and then Ernie appears, and the main storyline of the episode is just put on pause, while these two grown men, one of whom is a bird, attempt to destroy each other and a significant portion of the surrounding infrastructure. They'll fight through shopping malls and onto trains and up the sides of buildings and across moving vehicles and through airplane fuselages and over Ferris wheels, causing significant property damage and probably injuring a substantial number of bystanders, and then Peter will eventually land some decisive blow. Ernie will seem to be definitively defeated, and Peter will walk back to whatever he was doing before, battered and bruised, covered in debris, and simply continue the conversation as though nothing happened. And then in the final seconds, the camera will cut back to Ernie lying still on the ground, apparently dead. And then one eye will open. The third major chicken fight, which happens during the season 5 episode, takes this formula and adds a new dimension to it that might be the most inspired creative choice in the whole saga. In the middle of the fight, during a brief pause in the violence, Ernie and his wife Nicole actually take Peter out to dinner. There's a calm, slightly awkward restaurant scene where the three of them sit across from each other, and it's completely unclear what the social register of this interaction is supposed to be. Are they friends now? Is this a truce? Is dinner just what you do when you take a break from trying to kill someone? And then the check comes. There's a disagreement about the check, and the fight immediately resumes at exactly the same intensity as before, as if the dinner interlude never happened. Peter's relationship with his own physical well-being was another rich vein of comedy in the middle seasons. He had a knee injury in one stretch of episodes, specifically the gag where he hurts his knee and simply sits on the ground making a particular sound. A long, drawn-out sustained note of anguish that the show plays for what keeps being described as an uncomfortably long time. And it was an uncomfortably long time. But there was something almost meditative about it if you surrendered to it. Peter, sitting on the ground, unable to do anything but experience his knee pain. The world continuing around him, life going on. And Peter just sitting there in his private catastrophe, making that sound. He also had a recurring battle with a Spanish-speaking gardener named Miguel in one season that spiraled into a full-scale turf war over the Griffin family's backyard. He once became convinced he was actually a pirate after spending an afternoon at a nautical-themed museum. He declared sovereignty over a small patch of land beside the Griffin house that the deed papers didn't technically cover and established what he called the Nation of Pretoria, with himself as the head of state. He actually attempted to join the United Nations as a sovereign nation. The United Nations did not take meetings with Peter Griffin, which seemed to surprise Peter enormously. One of the lesser-discussed Peter storylines that holds up remarkably well is from Season 3, in which Peter becomes a parent advocate at Meg and Chris's school after believing that the education system is failing his children. He ends up becoming genuinely passionate about it, attending meetings, fighting with the school board, eventually getting far more invested in the whole system than anyone expected from a man who initially couldn't pick his own kids out of a lineup of students. It's an episode that gives Peter something to care about beyond his immediate self-interest, and those episodes where Peter gets focused on something external and chases it with his usual complete lack of nuance often produce the show's most satisfying storylines. There was the episode where Peter discovers he has no pain receptors in certain parts of his body and spends the first act cheerfully putting himself in the path of dangerous situations to demonstrate this, which leads to a whole cascade of increasingly elaborate tests of this supposed ability, and eventually, inevitably, a situation where the absence of pain turns out to be a significant problem rather than a superpower. And there was the incredible stretch in Season 4 where Peter becomes fixated on the idea that he might be a genius after scoring well on some test he took online. He begins affecting the mannerisms of what he believes a genius looks like, which is to say, something loosely based on a mid-century European intellectual, and begins surrounding himself with what he believes are genius-level activities, which includes things that are decidedly not genius-level activities, but that Peter has convinced himself qualify. The episode doesn't exactly resolve with Peter humbled and returned to his baseline. It resolves with Peter having learned nothing but somehow the situation having corrected itself around him, which is very true to who Peter is as a character at his best. The world accommodates him without him ever having to actually change. Then there are the drinking storylines, which run through the entire show like a thread. The Drunken Clam, the bar where Peter and his friends Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland spend a frankly alarming percentage of their non-working hours, is one of the most consistent settings in the show. The bar is run by a man named Horace through most of the series run, and it's a place that operates on the logic of a specific kind of American working-class male friendship. You show up, you sit in your regular seats, you drink your regular drinks, you talk about things that don't matter while occasionally touching on things that do matter, and the friendship is demonstrated by continued presence more than by anything that gets said. Peter's relationship with alcohol is played mostly for laughs, though the show occasionally lets something a little more complicated surface in these moments. In one early episode, Peter makes a genuine promise to Lois that he won't drink at a stag party and then drinks 37 beers, and the show plays the gap between the promise and the action both for comedy and for a small, honest note about what it actually costs someone to keep being disappointed by a person they love. Lois is frustrated but not destroyed. She knows who Peter is. She also, in those early seasons, knows that Peter knowing who he is doesn't excuse everything he does. And she says so, clearly and without rancor. And Peter, in his own stumbling way, understands. That dynamic, Peter at his most impulsive, Lois at her most patient but not infinitely patient, the whole family absorbing the fallout and somehow still being intact at the end, was the engine that made the show's best storylines run. Section 3. Stewie Griffin, evil genius in a yellow shirt? If you had to explain to someone who had never seen a single episode of Family Guy what made the show special, you could do a lot worse than just describing Stewie Griffin to them in detail. Here is a baby. He is 1 year old. He is round-headed and gap-toothed in the way that cartoon babies are, and he wears a yellow shirt and a diaper, and he sits in a high chair at the family dinner table and eats baby food like a normal infant. And when he opens his mouth, out comes the voice of a refined, precisely articulate, vaguely menacing British person who sounds like he's been studying the collected works of every Bond villain ever written. Stewie wants to kill his mother. That's not a metaphor. That is his stated, actively pursued primary objective. He wants Lois Griffin dead, and he has devoted considerable engineering resources to making this happen. He has built ray guns in his bedroom. He has constructed mind control devices capable of subjugating crowds of people. He has designed machines that can alter weather patterns. He has engineered robots. He has, in the show's early seasons, come remarkably close to actual world domination on multiple occasions. And the reason it never quite comes together for him isn't usually incompetence. He is genuinely, outlandishly brilliant. It's the interference of circumstances that his intelligence can account for individually, but that he can't always account for all at once. The comedy of early Stewie operates on a very specific, dramatic irony. The audience knows what Stewie is saying. We hear him clearly. We understand that the baby in the high chair is describing, in precise and theatrical detail, exactly how he intends to destroy Lois. And the people around him, Lois, Peter, Meg, Chris, the neighbors, the extended family hear something else entirely. They hear babbling. They hear the ambient noise of a baby. They see an infant looking at them with an expression that might be curiosity or might be something darker, and they respond with the completely standard parental automatic reflex. Cooing, offering more food, adjusting the bib. Brian is the exception. Brian can understand Stewie, and from the very early episodes, it's clear that their relationship is structured around this. Brian knows exactly what Stewie is doing and what Stewie wants, and his response to this knowledge is essentially the same as his response to everything Peter does. A kind of resigned, dry, occasionally impressed acknowledgement that the world is strange and that he has somehow ended up adjacent to some of its strangest corners. Let's walk through some of the most memorable Stewie storylines from those early seasons, because they repay close attention. In Season 1, there's an episode called Stewie Loves Lois, which is actually a Season 5 episode that functions as a kind of thesis statement about the Stewie-Lois relationship, but the foundational version of their dynamic is established much earlier, in the pilot and the first season's early episodes, where Stewie's plots against Lois are elaborate and consistent and always just slightly off from succeeding. One of his earliest fully realized plans involves a weather machine. He builds it, it works, the weather is at his command. And then something small goes wrong, a mechanical hiccup, an unforeseen variable, Lois noticing something she shouldn't notice at exactly the wrong moment, and the plan has to be abandoned. But Stewie is not discouraged. He is never really discouraged. He simply makes note of what went wrong, files it away for future reference, and begins planning the next attempt with the patient confidence of someone who believes, deeply and correctly, that they are smarter than everyone around them. The episode Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story, which was released as a direct-to-video film compiled from the last 3 episodes of Season 4, takes the Stewie mythology somewhere genuinely unexpected. In this story, Stewie has a near-death experience. He falls into the family pool and almost drowns, and during this experience has a vision of his future self. Future Stewie turns out to be a man named Stu Griffin, a complete disappointment by Stewie's current standards, living in a small apartment, working a mundane job, clearly having abandoned all of his ambitions somewhere along the way. The horror of this vision for current Stewie is complete. Everything he has been working toward, the domination, the conquest, the mother elimination, all of it has apparently come to nothing, and the adult version of himself is just ordinary. So Stewie does what Stewie does. He travels to the future using his time machine, which by this point in the show's run has been established as something he built specifically to avoid the pain of teething, and he attempts to intervene in his own life trajectory. The resulting story is genuinely interesting because it asks a question that the show rarely gets explicit about. What would Stewie actually be without his villainy? Who is he underneath all the scheming? And the answer the show seems to offer is that he's someone searching for something, though the film never quite commits to what that something is. The time machine itself deserves its own section because it becomes one of the most important objects in the entire show's mythology. Stewie builds it in the first season, initially for the teething-related purpose the show jokes about, but it quickly becomes the mechanism through which some of the show's most ambitious storytelling happens. The logic of Stewie's time machine is wonderfully inconsistent. Sometimes using it creates paradoxes that have to be urgently resolved, and sometimes it seems to change history with no ripple effects at all. But the inconsistency is never really a problem, because the machine is always in service of whatever story the writers want to tell that week, and those stories are often terrific. There's Stewie's relationship with his half-brother Bertram, who is introduced as the result of a sperm donation Peter made years earlier at a local clinic. Bertram is essentially another evil genius baby. But where Stewie's villainy has developed over time and has texture to it, Bertram is more straightforwardly malevolent. Their rivalry is the closest thing the show has to a peer relationship for Stewie, another being who operates on roughly the same intellectual level, which is not something Stewie encounters often. Their conflicts over multiple episodes involve Stewie's time machine, questions about whether Bertram has the right to exist given the paradoxes their rivalry creates, and eventually a final confrontation that resolves the Bertram storyline in a way that's more emotionally sophisticated than you might expect from a show about cartoon babies trying to murder each other. Stewie's inventions are worth cataloging because they accumulate into something that paints a genuinely impressive picture of what one-year-old child prodigy is capable of when left unsupervised. Beyond the time machine and the mind control device and the weather machine, he builds a shrink ray that eventually gets used on both himself and Brian, a growth ray, a device for teleportation that works imperfectly enough to cause significant problems, a robot duplicate of himself that takes on an independent life, various weapons including what can only be described as a death ray in the traditional sci-fi villain sense, a cloning device that produces a version of Stewie that turns out to be significantly worse than the original, and at various points throughout the show's run, vehicles and transportation devices and surveillance equipment of various kinds. He's also an accomplished linguist, apparently speaking multiple languages including German and Latin at various points. He's a capable musician. He's an enthusiastic theater kid when the opportunity presents itself. He's written, or at least has strong opinions about, significant works of literature. He has aesthetic preferences that run toward the sophisticated and the slightly antiquated. He genuinely seems to prefer things from earlier eras, whether in art or music or fashion, and this gives him a quality that's unusual in any character, let alone one who is meant to be a one-year-old. He feels like a person who has actually developed tastes through lived experience. One of the most discussed Stewie storylines from the later middle seasons is the episode called Mission Impossible, which aired in Season 3. Lois becomes pregnant again, and Stewie learns about this, and his response is to travel inside Peter's body, using one of his miniaturization devices in order to intercept and destroy the potential sibling before it can come to exist. Because Stewie understands, correctly, that a new baby in the household would represent a threat to his position and his resources. He travels through the biological landscape of Peter's internal systems. The show renders this with a kind of gleeful, anatomical looseness, and the adventure inside Peter Griffin's body is every bit as strange as it sounds. He finds the potential sibling, who turns out to be a fully formed personality. He calls him Bertram in this appearance, which establishes the half-brother character, and their interaction is unexpectedly meaningful. Stewie arrives intent on destruction and finds something he wasn't prepared for, a personality he can actually relate to. And in a moment that tells you something important about who Stewie is even at his most villainous, he hesitates. Later seasons explored Stewie in directions that produced both some of the show's most beloved content and some of its most debated choices. The Road 2 episodes, which we'll discuss in full in their own section, gave him a consistent adventure partner in Brian and a regular format for the show to do something completely different from its usual structure. The identity exploration episodes gave him emotional depth that his original evil genius persona couldn't accommodate. The friendship with Brian gave him somewhere to put whatever warmth existed underneath all the plotting. But there's a reason fans who loved early Stewie still talk about him with a kind of gentle mourning. The original Stewie was genuinely one of a kind. There has never been another character quite like him in animation. A baby who was also a villain, simultaneously utterly dependent and shockingly capable, existing in a domestic space that was completely beneath his ambitions while also being, in some fundamental way, exactly where he belonged. He was dangerous, and he was funny, and he was, in those early episodes, slightly terrifying in the way that the best comedy villains are. You didn't quite know what he'd do next. The later Stewie is warmer, he's more accessible, he has genuine friendships and genuine vulnerabilities and genuine relationships that matter to him. But the thing he lost along the way, the unpredictability, the menace, the sense that there was real darkness underneath the diaper was irreplaceable, and the show never fully found a way to compensate for its absence. Section 4. Brian Griffin, the dog who wanted to be a writer. Brian Griffin walks upright, drinks martinis, drives a car when the situation calls for it, and has been working on a novel for what appears to be decades. He is, by every conventional measure, the most functional member of the Griffin household. He has opinions, he has read things, he can recommend wines and will do so unprompted. He is, in the early seasons, the character who grounds the show, the one who can look at the complete collapse happening around him and respond with something dry and accurate and slightly funny. And he is, consistently, the most tragic figure in the entire show. This might sound like an exaggeration. Brian is a talking dog who lives in a house with a family that feeds him and gives him a home. He drinks good scotch. He has an active romantic life. His situation could be a lot worse. But the tragedy of Brian, at least in the early seasons, is that he knows exactly how much potential he has and cannot quite close the gap between that potential and his actual output. He's been working on the novel for years. He talks about it constantly. He references it as though it's nearly done, nearly ready, always almost there. And we never see it get finished, and we start to suspect that the novel is less a project in progress and more a story Brian tells himself about who he is. He's a failed writer in the most honest sense, not someone who has tried and been rejected by a publishing industry that didn't understand his work, but someone who hasn't quite been able to finish the work at all, because finishing it would mean submitting it to judgment, and submitting it to judgment would mean finding out if the story he tells himself about his own intelligence and depth is actually accurate. This is rich territory for a comedy show, and the early seasons mine it beautifully without ever lingering on it so long that the show becomes depressing. Brian's insecurity about his writing is always present but never overwhelming. It flavors his interactions with other characters. There's a particular note he hits when someone challenges his intellectual credentials that sounds exactly like defensiveness but that he'd never admit to, and it gives his relationship with Lois a complicated warmth because Lois is one of the few people who seems to see Brian clearly and kindly at the same time. Brian has feelings for Lois. This is stated explicitly in some episodes and implied strongly in others, and the show handles it with more care than you might expect. Brian doesn't pursue it. He doesn't allow himself to pursue it. He understands that Lois is Peter's wife, and that their marriage is a real thing that exists in the world. And whatever Brian feels about Lois, he holds it back. This makes him, paradoxically, more sympathetic than a lot of characters who actually get what they want. Brian's unrequited feeling for Lois is a wound he carries quietly, and the dignity with which he carries it says something about who he is. His relationship with Peter is the other great friendship of the early seasons. They're best friends in the way that doesn't quite make sense if you examine it too carefully. Peter is loud and impulsive and not particularly interested in the things Brian cares about, and Brian is nuanced and considered and often frustrated by Peter's complete inability to take anything seriously. But their friendship works because of those differences rather than despite them. Brian provides the commentary that makes Peter's chaos meaningful. Peter provides the chaos that gives Brian's commentary something to respond to. They need each other. There's a beautiful early episode called Brian Does Hollywood from season 1, in which Brian goes to Los Angeles to pursue his creative dreams. He gets a job as a writer on a quiz show, which isn't exactly the literary achievement he was hoping for, but he takes it as a foothold. And then things go sideways in multiple directions at once, as they tend to when Brian is involved. He ends up directing adult films under a pseudonym while still trying to maintain his sense of himself as a serious artist. The episode handles the gap between aspiration and reality with surprising gentleness, and by the end, Brian has both succeeded at something and learned something about the price of that success. There's the episode Brian in Love, from Season 2, in which Brian realizes he's been having some involuntary behavior. Specifically, he's been having accidents on the floor of the Griffin house, something a dog simply does not do by choice. And he eventually has to reckon with the fact that this involuntary behavior is connected to suppressed feelings he hasn't been willing to acknowledge. The therapist he sees in this episode is one of the show's funniest secondary characters for those few scenes, and the way the episode handles what Brian eventually discovers about himself is both funny and genuinely compassionate. Brian's various romantic relationships through the middle seasons are worth dwelling on because they paint a consistent picture of someone who keeps falling for the wrong person, and who understands this about himself but cannot seem to stop. He falls for unavailable women, women who are passing through, women who are involved with other people, women who are interested in him for reasons that don't have anything to do with who he actually is. He has a relationship with a woman named Tracy, a woman named Lauren, various others. Each one ends in a way that's either sad or chaotic or both, and Brian absorbs each ending with the quiet stoicism of someone who has started to believe that this is just how things go for him. His relationship with alcohol, which runs through the entire show, is treated with a complexity that occasionally surprised viewers. The show doesn't moralize about Brian's drinking. It doesn't stage intervention episodes or recovery storylines in the way that a more earnest show might. But it does acknowledge, in small moments and throwaway lines, that Brian drinks more than he should, that the drinking is sometimes a response to things he'd rather not feel, and that the scotch in the safety deposit box at the bank, and the martinis at the house, and the beers at the Drunken Clam are all connected to a single underlying current that runs beneath Brian's surface of sophistication and self-possession. The episode where Brian joins the army, called Saving Private Brian, from Season 5, is one of the more unexpected places the show takes him. He doesn't join for patriotic reasons. He joins because Stewie is enlisting and Brian feels implicated in encouraging this, and so he enlists alongside him, figuring he can talk Stewie out of it before anything too serious happens. This being Family Guy, they both end up in basic training, and then in an actual war, and the show uses the setting to do something it does surprisingly well when it tries: genuine observational comedy about the gap between how institutions present themselves and how they actually operate. Brian's political opinions, which become much more prominent in later seasons than they were early on, are at their best when they're just one ingredient in a more complex scene rather than the entire point. Early Brian having political opinions feels natural. It's part of his intellectual posturing, part of the persona he maintains of being a sophisticated and engaged person who thinks carefully about the world. Later, Brian having political opinions becomes the whole of his personality in some episodes, and the difference between those two modes is enormous. In the first mode, his opinions reveal something about who he is. In the second mode, they obscure everything else about who he is, and the character suffers for it. But the Brian of Seasons 1 through 5, when he's functioning at his best, is one of the great supporting characters in animated television. He is not, technically, a supporting character. He's a regular, one of the show's main cast, but in structural terms he functions as the show's conscience, the voice that keeps the chaos from becoming completely meaningless. He's the one who asks whether what's happening makes sense. He's the one who points out when Peter has gone too far, who notes the actual consequences of things that the rest of the family simply absorbs. He does this with wit rather than earnestness, which is what makes it work. A preachy conscience is annoying. A sardonic conscience who seems faintly embarrassed by his own moral clarity is something much more watchable. Section 5. The Road to Episodes, a series within a series. Somewhere in the production offices of Family Guy, very early in the show's run, someone made the decision that would result in some of the best animated television of the 2000s and 2010s. That decision was, Brian and Stewie should go on a road trip. In the style of the classic Bob Hope and Bing Crosby Road, pictures of the 1940s, with musical numbers. That's it. That's the concept. And from that starting point, 8 episodes spread across the show's entire run were produced. and they are, as a collection, probably the single best argument that Family Guy at its peak was doing something genuinely creative and surprising. The template established by the first of these episodes, Road to Rhode Island from Season 2, goes something like this. Brian and Stewie, for whatever reason the episode has contrived, end up away from home and need to get back. Getting back turns out to be more complicated and more eventful than either of them anticipated. Along the way, they have at least one musical number. They have adventures. They learn something about each other or are reminded of something they already knew but needed to be reminded of. And they make it back changed in some small but real way by what happened. It sounds simple because it is simple. The genius of the Road 2 format is that the simplicity of the structure leaves maximum room for the specifics of any given episode to be as strange and elaborate and emotionally ambitious as the writers want to make them. Road to Rhode Island starts relatively modestly. Brian has to pick Stewie up from his grandparents' house, Lois's parents, who live in Newport, Rhode Island, which is portrayed with the specific gleaming wealth of old New England money, and bring him back to the Griffin household. They miss their flight home. They end up at a motel, and in the quiet of that motel room, something happens that genuinely catches you off guard if you're watching for the first time. Brian has a breakdown. He finds the farm where he was born. He finds his mother, and his mother, it turns out, has been dead for some time. She was stuffed and put on display in the farmhouse, a fixture of the decor, inanimate in the most permanent way. And Brian, who has never really talked about his family background or his origins or any of the feelings attached to them, has to sit with this discovery in front of Stewie, who is the only person he has with him in this moment. Stewie's response to Brian's grief is in this episode, in these early seasons, something remarkable. He is gentle. He is present. He doesn't deflect with cruelty or try to make it about himself. He just sits with Brian while Brian processes something that turns out to have been there all along. The episode ends with Brian and Stewie riding the rails back toward home, and they sing a song. The song is set to the melody of Road to Morocco from the original Bing Crosby and Bob Hope film series, and the lyrics are about them, about what makes them different and what makes them work together anyway. And it's funny and it's sweet, and it's the kind of ending that makes you feel good in a way that's hard to exactly explain. Road to Europe, the second entry, is probably the weakest of the series, though it has its own pleasures. Stewie becomes obsessed with a British children's television program called Jolly Farm Review, and its presenter, a woman called Mother Maggie. He decides he'd rather live in the world of Jolly Farm than continue living in the Griffin household, which he finds intellectually beneath him. He and Brian end up in Europe through a series of travel mistakes that start when Stewie boards a plane he believes is going to England and ends up in the Middle East, and the episode uses the European settings to do things that feel genuinely playful. They steal a camel using a song. They take a hot air balloon to the Vatican. They end up in Amsterdam. The musical number in this episode, You and I Are So Awfully Different, is one of the better songs the show produced in this era, and it neatly captures the specific dynamic of their friendship. They are, by almost every measure, completely unsuited to each other, and yet here they are, traveling through Europe together on a mission that makes no rational sense. Road to Rupert from Season 5 is motivated by something that turns out to be emotionally very important to Stewie, the accidental sale of his teddy bear. The Griffin family has a yard sale, and in the chaos of the event, Rupert, Stewie's beloved stuffed bear, who in Stewie's imagination is a fully realized individual with feelings and preferences and a genuine relationship with Stewie, gets sold to another kid. Stewie is devastated in a way that the episode treats with complete seriousness. The bear matters. The bear has always mattered, and Brian, partly out of guilt for the role he played in the sale, agrees to help Stewie get Rupert back. The road trip takes them to Aspen, Colorado, which is where the kid who bought Rupert lives, and the journey involves a lot of winter sports and cold weather, and the increasingly desperate quality of Stewie's need to be reunited with his bear. When they finally get there and recover Rupert, the relief Stewie feels is genuine and enormous, and the moment is played straight, without irony, without a joke underneath it. Stewie loves Rupert. This is true and it matters, and the show knows it. Road to Germany from Season 7 introduces a dimension that the earlier Road 2 episodes didn't have, a supporting character who accidentally triggers the adventure. Mort Goldman, one of the recurring characters from the neighborhood, mistakes Stewie's time machine for a bathroom. The time machine is in a closet in Stewie's room, and Mort is, in this moment, very urgently in need of a bathroom, and accidentally sends himself back in time to Poland in September of 1939. That is, for clarity, the moment when Germany invaded Poland at the start of the Second World War. Brian and Stewie follow Mort into the past to rescue him, and the episode uses the Second World War setting to do some genuinely dark comedy about one of history's worst events. This is risky territory, and the show knows it. There are jokes here that could very easily misfire, and some viewers felt they did, but the episode keeps Mort's Jewish identity central to the stakes in a way that gives the humor some grounding. Mort being in Poland in September 1939 is not just inconvenient. It is genuinely dangerous in a specific and historically serious way. The episode's resolution involves them needing to get the fuel to power the time machine home, which means acquiring a significant quantity of heavy water, which in turn means interacting with the historical reality of the war in ways that feel both absurd and strangely respectful. Road to the Multiverse, which opens Season 8 and is often cited as one of the best episodes in the show's entire run, takes the format in a direction that expands its possibilities enormously. Stewie has built a remote control device, not a time machine this time, but a dimensional travel device that can switch between parallel universes, each operating on slightly different physical or historical laws. He and Brian use it to hop between dimensions, and each dimension is a different visual and tonal world. There's a Pixar-style animated universe, rendered in gorgeous three-dimensional computer animation, which is beautiful and warm and immediately satirized by the fact that even in a Pixar universe, the characters still say things that are recognizably Family Guy things to say. There's a universe where everything looks like a live-action Japanese game show. There's a universe operating on Disney's classic hand-drawn animation style, complete with singing woodland creatures, and a somewhat disturbing undercurrent that the episode uses to comment on the ideology embedded in certain kinds of wholesome entertainment. There's a universe where dogs are the dominant species and humans are kept as pets, an obvious structural inversion that nevertheless produces genuinely funny results because of how thoroughly it commits to the premise. There's a universe where Christianity never existed, and the world is apparently centuries more scientifically advanced as a result, which is the episode's most explicitly political dimension hop, and one of its most entertaining. The episode cycles through these universes with the rapid-fire energy of a show that knows it has a great concept and wants to squeeze every possible variation out of it in 22 minutes, and it works. The visual variety, combined with the consistency of Stewie and Brian's dynamic across all these different aesthetics, gives the episode a quality that most Family Guy episodes didn't have. It felt genuinely creative in a way that went beyond just a good premise. The execution matched the ambition. Road to the North Pole, which aired as the Season 9 Christmas episode and ran for an extended hour-long format, is the darkest and most emotionally ambitious of all the Road to episodes. Stewie goes to a shopping mall to meet Santa, is brushed off roughly by a mall Santa who is having a very bad day, and decides that Santa must be punished. He and Brian travel to the actual North Pole to find Santa, and exact whatever revenge a one-year-old evil genius is capable of exacting on the jolly old elf. What they find at the North Pole is not what either of them expected. Santa is real, but he is not well. He's exhausted and weakened, barely surviving from one Christmas to the next. The workshop is in a state of serious disrepair. The reindeer have gone feral. The elves are desperate and overworked. The whole North Pole infrastructure is on the verge of collapse because the demand for Christmas has grown so far beyond what any single person or any being, even a magical one, could sustain. And so Brian and Stewie have to take over. They have to actually deliver the Christmas presents, all of them. This produces a sequence that starts as slapstick. They are not good at this, and gradually becomes something more disturbing, as the show commits fully to what the scale of the task would actually mean. Houses are destroyed. Chimneys don't work the way the Christmas mythology requires them to. Children are accidentally harmed in the process of trying to deliver gifts. By the time they've worked through the overnight delivery run, they are covered in damage that the show doesn't paper over. And they sit together in the freezing North Pole morning, exhausted and beaten up, having completed the task but at real cost. The episode ends with Stewie having gone from wanting to harm Santa to genuinely caring about whether the Christmas operation can be sustained. It's a complete character journey compressed into one episode, and it's one of the warmest things the show ever produced while also being genuinely dark in ways that family Christmas specials usually aren't. Road to Vegas, from Season 11, does something structurally interesting. It splits Brian and Stewie into two pairs. Stewie's teleportation device malfunctions and creates duplicate versions of them, and both pairs end up in Las Vegas simultaneously, having parallel adventures that keep almost overlapping and occasionally do. One pair has a good time, the other pair has a catastrophically bad time. And the episode uses this split to make some jokes about luck and probability, and the specific cruelty of Las Vegas as a place designed to make you feel like the good outcomes are just around the next corner. Road to India, from season 15, takes Brian's romantic tendencies as its starting point. He falls for an Indian customer service representative named Padma, who he's spoken to on the phone. He becomes obsessed with her. He convinces Stewie to go with him to India to find her. And what he finds when he gets there is that Padma is engaged, that her family has very specific expectations for her future, and that Brian's romantic vision of who she is doesn't quite match with who she actually is. The episode uses Brian's obliviousness as a way to examine how romantic fantasies often have more to do with the person doing the fantasizing than with their object, and it concludes with Brian learning something about himself that he'd probably rather not know. Taken together, the Road to episodes form a small canon of their own, a series within the series that consistently represents Family Guy at its most inventive and most emotionally honest. They are the episodes that fans most reliably recommend to people who are skeptical of the show. They are the episodes that prove what the show was capable of when it gave itself permission to try something genuinely different. Section 6. The Griffin Family's Strangest Adventures Together and Apart. Outside of the Road to episodes, the Griffin family as a unit produced some of the show's most memorable storylines, the ones that required everyone in the household to be involved in the chaos simultaneously, or that sent various family members off on adventures that then collided in unexpected ways. The Y2K episode, called Da Boom and from Season 2, is one of the earliest examples of the show going completely and maximally ambitious with a single concept. The premise is exactly what it sounds like. It's New Year's Eve 1999, and Peter is convinced that the Y2K bug, the computer error that many people genuinely believed in 1999 would cause catastrophic technology, failures at midnight is going to destroy civilization. He has built a shelter in the basement, stocked it with supplies, and he has convinced the family to spend New Year's Eve in the shelter preparing for the end of the world. The joke, of course, is that Y2K actually happens in this episode. The whole world ends, all the technology fails, cities fall, and Peter emerges from his shelter into a post-apocalyptic landscape that looks like something out of a disaster movie. And his immediate response to discovering that civilization has collapsed is not horror or grief. It's a kind of vindicated satisfaction. He was right. He prepared. And now his family is among the survivors, which is a thing Peter Griffin has never been before. The rest of the episode follows the family traveling across a ruined landscape in search of Pawtucket, Rhode Island, where Peter believes that a Twinkie factory might still be operating and might represent a source of food and community for whatever remains of humanity. It's a long walk through a landscape full of other survivors who have already begun adapting to the post-apocalyptic world in ways that range from practical to deeply strange. They encounter a man called the Greased-Up Deaf Guy for the first time in this episode, which is significant because the Greased-Up Deaf Guy becomes one of the show's most beloved recurring bits, a man who is inexplicably covered in grease and who, when pursued, cannot be caught because of the grease. The episode also introduces the Giant Chicken feud, in a flashback that reveals that the whole thing started with an expired coupon, which, given how elaborate and destructive the feud becomes over the years, makes the origin feel appropriately absurd. The Griffin family vacation episodes are another rich category. The show took the family to places both real and fictional over its run: Las Vegas, San Francisco, England, Italy, Washington, D.C., the future, alternate dimensions, and each of these trips produced its own variety of chaos. In the Washington episode, Peter somehow ends up as a senior advisor to a political figure and briefly influences national policy before things go wrong in ways that require the family to flee the capital. In the England episode, the family navigates Lois's complicated relationship with her own class background against the backdrop of British class consciousness. In the Las Vegas episode, Peter's behavior in a casino produces a cascade of consequences that involves the entertainment industry, organized crime, and at least one situation where Peter is performing on a stage in front of an audience who expected someone else. The episode where Peter accidentally destroys the family's house and the Griffins have to live in a hotel for an extended period is one of the show's stranger domestic arrangements episodes. The hotel has its own ecosystem, other guests, staff, a pool that Peter treats as his personal swimming territory, a room service menu that Peter approaches with the energy of a man encountering abundance for the first time, and the episode captures something true about how a person like Peter would adapt to an environment designed to provide unlimited service on demand. He would become immediately and completely intolerable. The episode where Meg is accidentally declared dead, not literally, but in a bureaucratic sense, following a clerical error and has to navigate the world as a ghost of paperwork, interacting with systems that have no record of her existence, is one of the more creative premises the show ever built around her character. For one episode, Meg is legally invisible, and the show uses this to do something interesting. She discovers that the worst consequence of bureaucratic non-existence is that it's actually not that different from how her family has been treating her all along. The episode treats this as dark comedy rather than pure tragedy, which is what makes it work. There's also the extended arc where Peter and Lois discover a passage in their house that leads to a room that had been walled off and forgotten during some previous renovation, and inside the room they find evidence of a family that lived in the house decades before them. Photographs, personal belongings, remnants of a domestic life that ended for reasons the show slowly reveals. This is Family Guy doing something genuinely ghostly and atmospheric, using the structure of a mystery to explore questions about memory and legacy and what it means to leave a trace on a place. It's strange territory for this show, and the fact that it works as well as it does speaks to what the show could accomplish when it committed to a single tonal register for an extended period. The Christmas episodes deserve their own mention. Family Guy took the family Christmas special format and kept testing how dark it could take the concept while still being recognizable as a Christmas episode. The first major Christmas episode, A Very Special Family Guy Freakin' Christmas from Season 3, is one of the most well-regarded Christmas specials in animated television history. In this episode, everything that could go wrong with the Griffin family's Christmas preparations does go wrong, and the accumulated disasters drive Lois, who is the one doing all the actual work of making Christmas happen, toward a complete breakdown. The episode finds Lois, eventually, in the front yard, wrapped in lights, completely unhinged, having crossed some threshold of seasonal frustration that she cannot come back from. The contrast between the cheerful Christmas music and imagery and Lois's genuine psychological distress is exactly the kind of tonal dissonance that early Family Guy did better than almost any other animated show of its era. It's dark, but it's funny. It's funny because it's dark, and it understands that Christmas for the person doing the work of making Christmas happen is sometimes a much more precarious emotional experience than the holiday mythology suggests. Section 7. Quagmire more than a running joke. Glenn Quagmire is introduced in the show's first season as Peter's neighbor and friend, and for a long time he exists primarily as a single-note character, the one who is interested in women to an extent that the show treats as comic rather than alarming. He's smooth in a way that Peter is not, confident in a specific register, and his catchphrase, which we've all heard, becomes one of the most recognizable audio signatures of the show. But over the seasons, Quagmire develops into something considerably more interesting than a running joke about his romantic appetites. He gets a backstory. He gets contradictions. He gets episodes that take him seriously in ways that make everything else about him more interesting by contrast. The episode Teagues for Two from Season 9 reveals that Quagmire's original name was Glenn Quagelchek. He changed it at some point, and that he was obese as a child. He's half Polish, which the show uses to access a version of him that's more vulnerable than the cool, calculating version his adult persona projects. The fat kid who changed his name and remade himself into something more impressive is a surprisingly relatable foundation for a character who spends most of his screen time as a comedy construct. Quagmire's relationship with his family produces some of the show's most unexpected emotional territory. He has a daughter, Anna Lee, who is left on his doorstep by a woman he doesn't remember. He spends the episode called Quagmire's Baby trying to be a father to her, adapting his lifestyle, taking the responsibility seriously in a way that surprises his friends. He succeeds, more or less. He becomes a capable parent to this infant for the duration of the episode. And then, because Quagmire knows himself, he makes the decision that the best thing he can do for Anna Lee is to put her up for adoption, to find her a home with parents who can give her what she needs in ways that his particular life doesn't accommodate. He does this. She goes to a family that can care for her properly, and at the end of the episode, as he's leaving, Anna Lee reaches toward him from inside her new home. A baby who doesn't have the language to say anything about the complicated thing that has just happened to her, but whose gesture says something anyway. And Quagmire, who the show has spent years defining as someone who is consistently not equipped for depth, receives this gesture with a quietness that hits harder than any of the episode's explicit emotional moments. The episode about Quagmire's sister, Brenda, who appears in the episode Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q, from season 10, is one of the show's most ambitious attempts to deal with a genuinely serious subject, domestic abuse. Brenda is in a relationship with a man named Jeff Peterson who is controlling, violent, and dangerous. Quagmire recognizes this immediately and wants to help his sister leave the relationship, but Brenda is not ready to leave. She makes excuses for Jeff. She minimizes what's happening. She is doing what people in abusive relationships often do, adapting her understanding of reality to accommodate the person who is hurting her. The episode is not entirely successful. Some viewers felt that the show leaned too heavily on making Jeff cartoonishly awful, rather than engaging with the more complicated psychology of how these situations actually develop. But the intention behind the episode to do something more serious than a standard Family Guy storyline would require is genuine, and Quagmire's love for his sister and his frustration at being unable to simply fix her situation by force of will is one of the more honest emotional notes the show hit in this season. The episode Jerome is the New Black, from season 8, contains the speech that many fans consider the most important moment in Quagmire's entire character arc. Brian has done something that Quagmire finds offensive. Brian hit on someone he shouldn't have hit on, in front of someone who shouldn't have had to watch it, and this is the catalyst for Quagmire articulating, at length and with considerable force, exactly why he doesn't like Brian. He lists everything: the failed writing career, the hypocritical political posturing, the behavior with Lois, the lack of self-awareness, the fact that Brian is willing to talk about values all day long while consistently failing to live by any of them. What's interesting about this speech is that Quagmire, whose own behavior the show has spent years documenting in unflattering detail, is the one delivering it. The show is using him as a kind of broken mirror, a character who is himself significantly flawed, being the one to identify someone else's flaws accurately. Quagmire's critique of Brian is correct, and the fact that Quagmire is the one making it doesn't invalidate the critique. It just makes the whole thing considerably stranger. Two characters who are both, in different ways, far from perfect, looking at each other and seeing something they recognize. Quagmire's fatherhood episodes, taken together, suggest a character who is more aware of the gap between who he is and who he could be than his surface presentation admits. He knows what he's doing. He knows how his life looks from outside. And he's made a choice to keep living it this way, mostly, with occasional moments where the choice becomes visible as a choice rather than just the natural order of things. His friendship with Peter is one of the show's most consistent threads, and in the early seasons it has a warmth to it that transcends the comedy. These are two men who have known each other for a long time, who know each other's worst qualities intimately, and who show up for each other anyway. That's what friendship often is, and the show knew it. Section 8. Joe and Cleveland. The other half of the drunken clam. Joe Swanson and Cleveland Brown represent the flanks of Peter's core friend group at the Drunken Clam. And while they've always existed somewhat in Peter's orbit, both characters were given enough space over the years to develop into genuine presences in the show's world. Cleveland is the earliest addition to the friend group chronologically, in terms of how they became close with Peter. They knew each other from school, or from the neighborhood, or from some combination of both. The show's account of how they met shifts slightly depending on which episode you're watching, and Cleveland is characterized for most of his time on Family Guy as the group's calmer, more measured voice. He speaks slowly and with deliberation. He has what might be described as an extremely measured reaction time to almost every situation, which the show uses as a contrast with Peter's immediate explosiveness. Peter hears something and reacts. Cleveland hears something and appears to be still processing it several seconds later. This is a comedy tool that works because it's consistent, and because the slow reaction time isn't stupidity. It's more like a commitment to really thinking about things before responding. which in the context of Peter's circle of friends is a genuinely unusual quality. Cleveland's marriage to his wife Loretta, which occupies the first several seasons of the show, is troubled in ways the show acknowledges without always knowing what to do with. Loretta's increasing frustration with Cleveland's calm, measured nature, which reads to her as passivity, produces some genuinely uncomfortable episodes before the marriage ends. And Cleveland eventually leaves Stoolbend to move to Virginia for the Cleveland Show spinoff. His bathtub falling through his bathroom floor became one of the show's most reliable running gags, happening in episode after episode through no fault of anyone's in particular, just as a recurring fact of Cleveland's domestic life that the universe seems determined to impose on him. Joe Swanson's introduction, in the Season 1 episode A Hero Sits Next Door, establishes him immediately as a character with more dimensions than his disability might suggest. He moves in next door to the Griffins, and Peter is immediately intensely jealous of him. Joe is capable, charismatic, admired by everyone in the neighborhood, and his wheelchair doesn't define him in anyone's eyes because he refuses to let it. He was a police officer who was injured in the line of duty. The specifics of how get revised slightly over the course of the show, which either reflects the evolution of the writer's thinking or the inherent unreliability of how a person tells their own origin story, and he carries himself with the earned confidence of someone who has been tested and come through it. Over the seasons, Joe becomes one of the show's most emotionally complex recurring figures. His marriage to Bonnie is played for many different kinds of comedy: Bonnie's bottomless patience, Bonnie's occasional complete lack of patience, Bonnie's periodic attempts to leave Joe for various reasons that always eventually resolve. But underneath the comedy, there's a real portrait of a long marriage between two people who are both doing their best under circumstances that are genuinely difficult. The episode where Joe gets new legs, believe it or not, Joe's Walking on Air, from Season 6, is a genuinely interesting piece of the show's treatment of disability. Joe has been living his life in a wheelchair, and his friends, including Peter, have adapted to this reality along with him. And then the possibility of walking again presents itself, and Joe takes it. He gets the surgery, he gets the new legs, he can walk, and then everything falls apart. Not for Joe specifically, but for the dynamics around him. Because Joe in a wheelchair was, in some essential way, the Joe that his relationships were built around. His marriage had adapted to his disability. His friendships had adapted to it. Even his sense of himself was partly organized around the particular kind of resilience required to live as he was living. The new legs give him something back that he'd lost, but they also destabilize everything that had grown up around his life without them. By the end of the episode, the situation reverses. Joe ends up back in his wheelchair, and both the episode and Joe seem to reach the conclusion that the life he had built around his actual circumstances was a more honest version of his life than the hypothetical different life the surgery briefly offered. The episode called Joe's Revenge, from Season 11, deals with something that Joe has been carrying through the entire run of the show: unresolved business with the person who put him in the wheelchair. The show has changed the specifics of who this was and how it happened over the years, but in this episode, Joe gets the chance to confront the person responsible directly, and the show uses this as an opportunity to do something it doesn't do very often with Joe: give him a scene that's purely about what he carries, without the comedy deflection that most Joe scenes employ. The drunken clam scenes, taken as a whole across the show's run, build a cumulative portrait of male friendship that is funny and occasionally quite true. These four men, Peter, Joe, Quagmire, Cleveland, sit in their regular spots and talk, and what they talk about is almost never what they're actually feeling, but the fact that they keep showing up, season after season, episode after episode, says something about the value of a place where you're simply accepted as who you are without needing to explain it. Section 9. Meg Griffin's Hidden Depths and the Episodes That Got Her Right. There's a version of Meg Griffin that the show produced only occasionally, in scattered episodes throughout its run, that is one of the most sympathetic and fully realized characters in the show's entire cast. She's thoughtful, she's resilient, she's more perceptive about what's happening around her than anyone gives her credit for. She has genuine talent in directions the family almost never acknowledges. And she is capable, when the show allows it, of extraordinary emotional intelligence. The tragedy of Meg as a character isn't just what the show did to her in the dark stretch between seasons 4 and 14. The tragedy is that the better version of her was visible all along. In the episodes where the writers remembered to treat her as a person rather than a punchline, And the contrast between those episodes and the ones surrounding them makes the punchline episodes feel even more uncomfortable in retrospect. The episode Barely Legal from Season 5 is one of the earlier examples of the show taking Meg's interior life seriously. Brian takes Meg to her prom out of pity, because she doesn't have a date and the evening is initially something Meg simply endures. Another experience of being seen as not quite good enough, in a formal setting, on a night specifically designed to make social hierarchies visible. But something shifts during the evening, and Brian finds himself genuinely engaged with Meg as a person in a way he hadn't expected. She's funny when she's comfortable. She's sharp. She has things to say that are worth listening to. She develops a crush on Brian, which the episode eventually has to navigate, but the crush is almost beside the point. What matters in Barely Legal is the recognition scene, the moment where another character sees Meg clearly, without the family's accumulated contempt distorting the view, and finds someone actually interesting there. The Simpsons crossover episode from Season 13, called The Simpsons Guy, gives Meg something the main series almost never gives her: a peer relationship. She meets Lisa Simpson, and their friendship, which develops quickly over the episode's extended running time, works because both of these characters are intelligent girls who are undervalued by the worlds they live in. Lisa in her family, Meg in hers. They recognize each other in the specific way that people who are treated as less than recognize each other when they're together without the people who treat them that way. Lisa encourages Meg. She tells her that she matters. She asks about what Meg is interested in, what she's good at, what she cares about. And Meg, who is almost never asked these things by anyone in her actual life, opens up. The show uses this opening up as the occasion to reveal that Meg has a talent for playing the saxophone, a detail that feels specifically chosen because the saxophone is Lisa Simpson's instrument, and the show is suggesting that these two characters are more alike than anyone in either of their families has ever bothered to notice. The episode Peter's Sister, from Season 14, is one of the most important episodes in understanding what the show's treatment of Meg was actually about. It introduces Peter's sister, Karen, who bullied Peter viciously when they were growing up physically and emotionally, in ways the episode depicts with some genuine weight. And the episode draws a direct line between the abuse Peter received as a child and the abuse he deals out to Meg as an adult. He learned it. He was taught, through experience, that the person on the lower end of a family hierarchy is the appropriate target for the frustrations of everyone above them. He absorbed this lesson completely, unconsciously, and passed it on. Meg learns about this. She understands it. And she and Peter, in this episode, have a genuine moment of mutual recognition. He knows what he did was wrong, she knows where it came from, and they reconcile with an authenticity that the show rarely allows itself. It's a real moment. It suggests that real change is possible. And then the next episode arrives and everything is back to normal. This is the part of Meg's story that's most maddening to watch over time. The show knew how to write her. It demonstrated this repeatedly, in episode after episode, where she was given something real to do and responded with grace and intelligence. And then it reset, every time. The growth that should have accumulated didn't. The understanding that should have changed things didn't change things. The episode Seahorse Seashell Party, from Season 10, is the one that crystallized this dynamic most clearly and generated the most fan reaction. Meg is stuck in the house during a hurricane with her family, and the accumulated weight of years of mistreatment finally reaches a breaking point. She stands up and says everything she's been holding. She names what Peter has done. She names what Lois has done. She articulates the specific damage that their particular brand of cruelty has caused, and she does it with the calm and the precision of someone who has been rehearsing this conversation in her head for a very long time. It's a powerful scene. It feels like justice. And then the episode dismantles it by having Meg take it all back, not because she was wrong, but because the family falls apart without her as the designated target, and she loves her family enough to go back to absorbing their dysfunction. The message this sends, if you stop and think about it, is genuinely disturbing. But within the context of the episode, it's also a strange and specific kind of love story. Meg choosing to return to her role in the family isn't submission in the episode's logic, it's sacrifice. She understands exactly what she's doing and why she's doing it, and she does it anyway, because the alternative is watching her family destroy itself. Whether this is admirable or heartbreaking depends on how much of the surrounding context you're willing to hold at the same time. What Meg represents, at her best, is something the show's writers understood even when they weren't implementing it. The possibility that the person at the bottom of every social hierarchy is often the one who sees most clearly what the hierarchy is doing to everyone in it, precisely because they feel its weight without the insulation that higher positions provide. Meg sees her family clearly. She always has. And the episodes that allow her to act on what she sees, to speak, to fight back, to be acknowledged, are the episodes where she's the best character in the show. Section 10. The multiverse, time travel, and the sci-fi episodes nobody expected. Family Guy has always been, beneath the sitcom surface, a show that was deeply interested in the possibilities of science fiction. Not in the way that prestige science fiction is interested, not in exploring the philosophical implications of technology, or the nature of consciousness, or the future of humanity in a sustained way, but in the more playful sense of, what if we just did that? What if the time machine worked? What if there were parallel worlds? What if the rules that normally apply to this show simply did not apply to this episode? This genre of Family Guy episode, the sci-fi episode, the concept episode, the one where the premise is so far from the show's usual ground that it becomes its own kind of adventure, produced some of the most memorable and most discussed moments in the show's entire history. Road to the Multiverse, which we discussed in the Road to section, is the most elaborate version of this kind of episode, but it's far from the only one. Back to the Pilot from Season 10 is another particularly beloved entry. In this episode, Brian and Stewie use the time machine to travel back to the events of the very first episode, Death Has a Shadow, the 1999 pilot, and observe the earlier versions of themselves in that initial world. And Brian, being Brian, cannot resist the opportunity to interact with his past self with predictable consequences. He warns his past self about the September 11th attacks. Past Brian, hearing this warning from a mysterious version of himself from the future, acts on it. He publicizes the warning. The attacks are prevented, and the resulting change to the timeline produces a version of the United States that's radically different from the one Brian comes from. Different political history, different cultural trajectory, different world. The episode follows the chain of consequences from Brian's intervention through an increasingly strange alternative history, and the chaos compounds fast enough that what started as a small act of well-intentioned prevention becomes a much larger problem. The resolution requires Brian and Stewie to reverse what Brian set in motion, and there's a moment in this episode as Brian prepares to undo what he did that's quietly one of the most morally serious things the show ever attempted. He has to choose between a world where something terrible happened and the world as he knows it, versus a world where that terrible thing didn't happen, but where everything else about reality has become unrecognizable and worse. And he makes the choice that he has to make, for reasons the episode articulates clearly, and the weight of that choice is real. The episode Yug Ilimov, the title of which is Family Guy spelled backward, uses time reversal as its central mechanism. Brian has been tampering with Stewie's time machine, using it in unauthorized ways, for reasons that are initially played for comedy, and the accumulated mileage reversal reaches a tipping point and begins pulling time backward at an accelerating rate. The episode is structured in reverse. We see events happening in reverse order, rewinding through recent episodes and moments from the show's history, and the visual experience of watching the show's mythology run backward is both funny and unexpectedly moving. The stakes in Yug Yilimov escalate quickly because Stewie was born within the show's timeline, which means that if time runs far enough backward, Stewie will be unborn. He'll be erased. And this creates genuine urgency beneath the comedy, because Stewie's non-existence, even though we know it won't be permanent, is treated as a real loss, something worth preventing, something that matters. The episode ends with Stewie going through the experience of being born again, which is depicted as viscerally unpleasant in the specific way that Family Guy unpleasantness usually is, and Brian manages to fix everything at the last possible moment. Big Trouble in Little Quahog, from Season 17, is the episode where Stewie shrinks Brian as revenge for Brian calling him short. The shrinking is initially retributive, but then spirals into a situation where both of them are microscopic in the Griffin household, navigating a world that is suddenly enormous and dangerous in ways it never was at normal scale. Dust mites become monsters. The floor becomes a vast terrain to cross. The cat, which at normal size is merely irritating, becomes something close to a natural disaster. The episode is doing something that Family Guy did well when it committed to it, taking a silly premise and following it to its logical extremes with total commitment. The episode In Harmony's Way, from Season 12, sends Peter and Quagmire on a musical career that briefly makes them famous, discovering that they have an unexpected chemistry as a vocal duo that produces genuinely moving harmonies. Or so the in-universe audience believes, and uses the music industry backdrop to do some observational comedy about how the entertainment business actually works. The episode has moments that feel genuinely warm, especially the scenes where Peter and Quagmire are just singing together in Peter's living room, before the industry gets involved and everything becomes complicated. The episode Stewie Goes for a Drive, from Season 17, has Stewie, who at 1 year old has built a time machine and various weapons, but has never learned to drive a car, deciding to teach himself to drive. The mechanics of a 1-year-old attempting to operate a motor vehicle in the real world are handled with the specific brand of Family Guy physical comedy that works best when the stakes are allowed to escalate properly. What starts as a somewhat contained adventure becomes, gradually, a much bigger situation. Across all these episodes, the show demonstrates something important. It was always willing to break its own rules when the right story called for it. The sitcom baseline, the family in the house on Spooner Street, the bar, the neighborhood, the working lives of the adults, was a foundation, not a ceiling. The show could leave that foundation at any time and go somewhere completely different, and the best episodes took advantage of this freedom fully. Section 11. The emotional episodes nobody talks about. Family Guy is not widely discussed as an emotionally ambitious show. Its reputation is built on irreverence, on cutaway gags, on a kind of gleeful disregard for the emotional consequences of what it depicts. And this reputation is earned, at least for significant stretches of the show's run. But scattered through the chaos, particularly in the show's early and middle seasons, there are episodes that attempt something genuinely emotional and either fully succeed or come close enough that the attempt is worth acknowledging. These are the episodes that fans who love the show most deeply tend to talk about, not the funniest episodes, but the ones that did something unexpected with the feelings the characters contain. Brian and Stewie, the Season 8 episode where the two of them are locked in a bank vault over a weekend, is the clearest example of this. The episode was inspired by an episode of All in the Family, the classic CBS sitcom that MacFarlane and producer Caravallo were both fans of, in which Archie Bunker gets locked in his cellar alone, and the episode strips away all of the show's usual mechanisms to put two characters in a room together with nothing to do but talk honestly. The vault episode has no cutaway gags. This is significant because it's essentially the only episode of Family Guy that makes this choice. The cutaway is the show's fundamental tool, its most identified feature, the thing that defines its comedic identity. An episode without cutaways is, by definition, a different kind of episode. It's an episode that has to make everything happen through what the characters say to each other, through what's in the room, through the passage of real time in a confined space. What happens in the vault is a gradual process of two characters being honest with each other in ways they couldn't be anywhere else. They're locked in. There's nowhere to go. The usual social exits aren't available. And so, things get said that wouldn't get said in the normal flow of the show. Stewie admits how much Brian means to him. He admits that without Brian, his life would be unmanageable, not just functionally, but emotionally. He says that Brian gives his life purpose. This is a baby who has spent multiple seasons plotting world domination and trying to kill his mother, and what he's saying, in the quiet of a bank vault on a Saturday night, is that the talking dog is the most important relationship he has. And the way he says it, matter-of-factly, without performance, without the theatrical flourishes he usually employs, makes it feel completely real. Brian reveals something dark in this episode as well. He has a gun in his safety deposit box. Stewie asks why, and Brian's explanation is one of the most serious moments in the show's entire run. He says that sometimes life feels like too much, that he can't find meaning in it, that the scotch in the box was there for a last drink. This revelation is delivered without melodrama. It's in Brian's usual low-key voice, the same voice he uses for everything, and that quietness makes it hit harder than if the show had staged it as a big dramatic moment. Stewie's response is simply to ask Brian to read to him, and Brian does. He reads the beginning of David Copperfield, a novel about an orphan who has to find his way in a difficult world, which is not incidentally also a description of Brian's situation, and Stewie falls asleep listening to it. And in the morning, the vault opens, and Brian carries Stewie out without waking him. And that's where the episode ends. It's one of the most purely affecting moments the show ever produced. Not because anything dramatic happens, but because of the tenderness of that final image. A talking dog carefully carrying a sleeping baby out of a bank vault, and everything that happened between them the night before still present in the air. The episode Old Man Peter, from season 11, follows Peter when he injures his leg badly enough to require a long period of recovery, and during this recovery the show slows down to spend time with Peter in a more contemplative mode than he usually occupies. He's stuck at home. He can't do the things he normally does. He has to just be. And in the being, the episode finds something unexpected. A Peter who is capable of reflection, who has feelings about his life that he doesn't usually have access to, who loves his family in ways that his normal level of activity doesn't leave room to notice. The episode Viewer Mail 2, from season 9, which frames itself as a collection of short pieces inspired by viewer suggestions, includes a segment called Chap of the Manor, which reimagines Brian as an English butler in a Victorian house, and the segment is played with a gentleness and a specificity about the period that feels like the show indulging something it doesn't usually get to indulge. Pure pleasure and a well-executed aesthetic conceit without any need to undercut it. The episode where Brian publishes his novel partially through the machinations of Stewie, who helps him find the courage to actually finish and submit it, contains a moment where Brian reads a single sentence that he's proud of, and the joy on his face is genuine and unguarded, and the show lets it be that without immediately puncturing it. The novel is, the show later suggests, not very good, but the joy of having finally made the thing is real, and the episode gives Brian that joy without taking it away. The Thanksgiving episodes across the show's run have a tradition of doing something more emotionally earnest than the regular episodes. The Thanksgiving story that centers on the Quagmire family's history, in particular, allows Seth MacFarlane's voice work to access something warmer and more vulnerable than most of the material he's given. Holidays in the show's world tend to produce the conditions under which characters say things they've been holding back, and the Thanksgiving episodes exploit this consistently and well. Section 12. The wildest final seasons, where the show went next. By the time Family Guy moved into its later seasons, the 20s, the stretch of episodes that continued producing well past the point when most television shows would have reached either a natural conclusion or an unnatural but merciful cancellation. The show had become something different from what it started as, while also being unmistakably the same show it had always been. The characters were still there. The address was still Spooner Street. The Drunken Clam still served the same patrons in the same seats. But something in the texture had changed, in the way that everything changes over 20-plus years of continuous existence. Some of the changes were losses, but some of them were genuinely unexpected developments that the show hadn't been capable of in its earlier years. The later seasons of Family Guy took the show's concept of the multiverse and alternate realities much further than Road to the Multiverse had. There were episodes that put the characters in completely different genre contexts, Western settings, period dramas, science fiction futures, animated styles that were dramatically different from the show's standard look. Each of these genre experiments had the quality of giving the writers permission to do things the regular show didn't allow, and the best of them used this permission well. The episode where Stewie is revealed to have an elaborate fantasy life that the audience has been watching as if it were reality, that the entire Stewie mythology, the weapons and the world domination and the time machine, is an elaborate internal narrative that a regular one-year-old has constructed to make sense of his world, is one of the show's most audacious late-period moves. It's playing with a question that's been hovering over the show since the very first episode. How literally are we supposed to take Stewie? If his evil genius is real, that's one show. If it's a child's imagination, that's a different show. And the episode where the show commits to exploring this ambiguity directly produces something genuinely interesting, even though in the way that Family Guy almost always does, it doesn't hold the position long enough for the implications to fully develop. The episode Back to the Pilot's spiritual successor episodes, the ones that revisit old episodes, old moments, old versions of the characters have a quality of gentle nostalgia that the show wears more honestly as it gets older. A show that's been running for 25 years has a history that it can draw on, a texture of accumulated moments that mean something because they're shared with people who've been watching all this time. The later episodes that reach back into this history are doing something that earlier episodes couldn't do simply because the history didn't exist yet. The death of Ernie the giant chicken at Meg's hands, she rips his head off in a confrontation that the show seems to have been moving toward for years, even if it didn't know it is one of the late-period events that fans talked about extensively. Ernie had survived everything, Airplane propellers, explosions, apparently fatal injuries of every description. He had always been immortal in the specific way that recurring joke characters are immortal, because the joke requires him to come back, and then he doesn't come back. Meg Griffin, of all people, is the one who finally and permanently ends the chicken fight saga. And the show plays it with enough weight that it registers as an ending, not just another gag. Peter's evolution in the later seasons has been described in many ways, usually unflattering ones, but there are moments where the later Peter is doing something the earlier Peter couldn't have done, acknowledging, briefly and imperfectly, that he is not always the hero of his own story. These moments are rare, and they don't accumulate into genuine change, but they happen. And when they happen, they remind you of what the character could have been if the show had allowed him to grow the way the very best long-running characters grow, not by becoming unrecognizable, but by becoming more themselves in the deepest sense. Lois has grown more quietly than Peter, but perhaps more significantly. The Lois of the later seasons has a dryness and a self-possession that the earlier Lois, more openly anxious, more invested in maintaining appearances, didn't quite have. She's seemed too much to be shocked by anything. She's made her accommodations with the reality of her marriage and her family, and she's found, within that reality, a kind of freedom. The later Lois doesn't need things to be perfect. She needs them to be interesting, and they generally are. Stewie in the most recent seasons has been given the kind of storylines that explore what happens when the character's intelligence is turned toward understanding himself, rather than toward external projects. He's a teenager inside a baby's body emotionally, if not literally, and the show has gotten more interested in what that means as the series has gone on. There are episodes about identity, about belonging, about the complicated experience of being more aware of yourself than the people around you, which is something Stewie has always been, and that the show has only recently started treating as something interesting rather than something to play purely for comedy. The crossover episodes with The Simpsons and with other animated franchises have produced some of the most discussed moments of the later era. The Simpsons crossover, for all the baggage it carried about the relationship between the two shows and what their shared existence on Fox meant, was actually a surprisingly affectionate piece of work. It took both shows seriously as things that mattered to their respective audiences, and used the occasion of the crossover not to declare a winner or to make cheap shots, but to celebrate something they had in common. They were both shows about families in fictional small towns, both built on the specific comedy of ordinary people failing to live up to their own aspirations. The show's self-awareness, which started as an occasional quality and became much more pervasive in later seasons, has produced some episodes that genuinely succeed in making the meta-commentary feel like art rather than avoidance. There are episodes that comment on the show's own decline with enough specificity and enough genuine wit that the commentary is interesting in its own right, separate from whatever it's commenting on. A show that has been on long enough to have developed an honest understanding of its own weaknesses is in a different position than a show that's still pretending to be at its peak, and the best of the late Family Guy episodes occupy this position with something like grace. The episode where the writing staff is explicitly depicted within the show, where the characters become aware of the room, where their words and situations are being created, is the fullest realization of this self-awareness. The episode is strange and slightly uncomfortable and occasionally very funny, and it ends with the characters choosing to not know more about the nature of their own existence than they've already found out. They return to Spooner Street. They go back to being who they are, and the show continues. The drunken clam is still there. Peter still orders something he probably shouldn't. Joe tells a story about something that happened at the precinct. Quagmire says something that gets a reaction from the others. And whatever they were arguing about before they walked in, they set aside for a few hours in favor of being in the same room with people who have known them long enough that the pretense of being any particular version of themselves isn't necessary. That's what the show has always been. Underneath everything else. A portrait of what it looks like when people keep choosing each other despite all evidence that they should probably make different choices. The streets of the show's fictional Rhode Island town are full of people who have done terrible things to each other and have somehow arrived at the same address again anyway. That keeps happening, year after year, episode after episode, in the most gloriously unhinged ways the writers can invent. And there's something almost sweet about it when you look at it from far enough away. The family is still together. The chaos continues. The chicken fights are over, technically, but who really believes that? Who really believes that some version of Ernie isn't going to walk around a corner someday, expired coupon in hand, and start the whole thing over again? That's the show. That's been the show for 25 years. And as the animated sun sets over the fictional coastline, and the lights go on in the house on Spooner Street, and whatever insane situation the Griffins are currently in begins to sort itself out the way it always sorts itself out, partially, imperfectly, with someone crying and someone laughing, and someone who has just done something nobody can quite believe, it's possible to remember what made all of this worth caring about in the first place. It wasn't the smartest show, it wasn't always the kindest show, but it was alive in a way that very few shows, animated or otherwise, ever managed to sustain across so many years. And on its best days, in its best episodes, it was genuinely extraordinary. Section 13, Season 2 Deep Dive. The show finds its rhythm. Season 2 of Family Guy is one of those seasons that television historians tend to underrate because it sits between the novelty of a first season and the more settled confidence of later work. But Season 2 is actually where Family Guy figured out what it was. Not what it would eventually become, not the cutaway-heavy, shock-value-chasing machine of the later years, but what it was in its purest form. A show about a specific kind of American family, told with intelligence and warmth and a humor that was always a little darker than it let on. The season opens into a world that has absorbed the Griffin family's existence for a year and is comfortable enough with them to start pushing the boundaries of what they can do. The premiere episode, Da Boom, which we've already discussed, sets the template. Take something from the cultural moment in this case, the genuine anxiety around Y2K, and use it as the fuel for an adventure that goes completely off the rails, in all the ways a Family Guy adventure goes off the rails, while still landing somewhere emotionally coherent. But let's talk about some of the Season 2 episodes that don't get as much discussion as they deserve. There's the episode Holy Crap, which focuses on Peter's father, Francis Griffin, and his relationship with the family. Francis is a devout Catholic who disapproves of Peter and of most of what Peter has done with his life. He comes to stay with the Griffins, and the visit produces the specific kind of tension that exists between a father and a son who love each other but who are built to frustrate each other in every possible way. The Catholic guilt that Francis carries, and that he's spent Peter's entire childhood trying to transfer to Peter with limited success, becomes the comedic engine of the episode, but there's something more real underneath it. Francis wants his son to be a particular thing, and Peter isn't that thing, and neither of them quite knows what to do with that gap. The episode uses the Pope as a plot device in its third act, which is a move that requires more confidence than most shows would have in only their second season, and it pulls it off because the comedy of Peter's father finally receiving validation from the actual leader of the Catholic Church is genuinely funny and also, in a way that's hard to fully articulate, kind of touching. Francis gets what he wants. Not from his son, Peter doesn't become what Francis hoped, but from an authority that matters to Francis in the deepest way. And for a moment, that's enough. The episode Da Boom is in this season, as we've noted, but there's also Brian Wallows and Peter's Swallows, in which Brian discovers he has a singing voice and uses it to become a kind of caretaker for a shut-in named Pearl Burton. This episode is one of the early examples of Brian being given a storyline that takes his emotional interior seriously. He develops real affection for Pearl. She's dying, she makes this clear to him, with the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who has made their peace with what's coming, and Brian's response to being present with someone who is dying is one of the more honest emotional portrayals the show achieved in any season. Pearl knows she doesn't have long. She's not performing acceptance. She's genuinely in it, in the specific way that very old people who have lived long and full lives sometimes are, with a clarity about mortality that younger people find either comforting or terrifying depending on their own relationship to the subject. Brian sits with her. He sings to her. He shows up. And the episode earns its emotional conclusion because it's been building it honestly from the beginning. There's also the episode Let's Go to the Hop, in which Peter goes undercover at Meg's high school as a student, a plotline that would become a recurring type of Family Guy episode, and the comedy of a middle-aged overweight man attempting to pass as a teenager among actual teenagers is exactly as chaotic as you'd expect. But there's a secondary thread in this episode about Meg and her place in the social ecosystem of her school that's handled with surprising care. Meg isn't just the butt of the joke here. She's someone navigating a real social environment with real stakes, and the episode gives her that dignity even while everything around her is completely absurd. The season also gives us If I'm Din, I'm Lien, in which Peter promises an ill child on television during a telethon that he will get his favorite TV show uncancelled if the child recovers. The child recovers. The show does not get uncancelled. Peter has to cover this up, and the mechanism he uses involves something that quickly spirals into a neighborhood cult situation, with Peter accidentally becoming a divine figure to his neighbors. This is one of the early examples of the show going completely overboard with a premise in the best possible way, taking a small white lie and following it through every compounding consequence until the situation is unrecognizable from where it started. And there's a picture's worth $1,000 in which Chris's artistic talent is discovered. This is an episode that the show doesn't return to often enough, the idea that Chris, who presents as dim and awkward and generally lost, might have a genuine creative gift that his family has simply never noticed because they've never looked in that direction. The episode handles this with a lightness that works precisely because it doesn't overload the revelation with meaning. Chris is talented. The talent gets noticed. Things happen as a result of the talent being noticed. And Chris, being Chris, experiences all of this with a puzzled good nature that's one of the most consistent and least exploited character qualities in the show. Season 2 also features what might be the single best Peter and Brian episode before the show's later seasons started adjusting the dynamic. It's the episode Where's the Money, Lebowski? Well, the episode borrows heavily from that film's aesthetic and spirit, in which Peter gets involved with loan sharks due to his inability to manage his finances, and Brian becomes entangled in helping him navigate the consequences. The conversation in this episode between Peter and Brian, in the car, late at night, just talking about what's happening in their lives, has a quality that the Road 2 episodes would later develop more formally. Two people who are very different from each other, talking honestly, in the dark. Section 14. Season 3. The Peak Before the Break. Season 3 of Family Guy is, for many fans, the apex. It's the season that produced the highest concentration of episodes that work completely, from premise to execution to emotional landing. It's the season before the show was canceled, the season that, in retrospect, represents Family Guy at the height of its original powers. And it repays attention in a way that the later seasons, for all their ambition, don't quite achieve consistently. The season opens with The Thin White Line, in which Brian becomes a drug-sniffing dog for the police and discovers that he has a genuine aptitude for the work, and also that the constant proximity to narcotics is affecting him in ways he didn't anticipate. The episode deals with addiction in a way that's unusually honest for a comedy show, following Brian through a version of the standard addiction arc, without turning it into either an after-school special or a joke. Brian is good at something. The something is bad for him. He knows it's bad for him. He does it anyway. This is a pattern that the show depicts with the kind of neutral observation that's more uncomfortable than explicit judgment would be. The following episode, Brian Does Hollywood, sends Brian to Los Angeles for the reasons we discussed earlier, and the contrast between where Brian goes and what he finds there, between the literary career he imagined and the actual opportunities available to him, is handled with the specific black humor of someone who genuinely understands the entertainment industry's capacity to eat people's aspirations and produce something completely different. The Road to Europe is in this season, as is the episode Stuck Together, Torn Apart, which takes an extended look at what Peter and Lois's marriage actually looks like when they're forced to spend time apart. They try a trial separation not for serious reasons, but because of a misunderstanding that escalates in ways. Family Guy misunderstandings tend to escalate, and the episode uses the separation to show what each of them is like without the other. Peter without Lois is a man without structure. He doesn't fall apart dramatically. He just gradually becomes more himself, in all the ways that require Lois's presence to moderate. And Lois without Peter discovers something that the show is always a little careful about. She's capable of more than her current life requires of her. This is a tension the show returns to periodically throughout its run. Lois is smart, she's creative, she plays piano. She has a background and an education that prepared her for something considerably different from the domestic life she's ended up in. The show never fully commits to exploring what that means. It's a sitcom, and the sitcom requires certain arrangements to be maintained, but it does acknowledge the gap, and in the episodes that acknowledge it most directly, Lois is the most interesting character in the room. There's the episode Mr. Saturday Night, which deals with Peter's layoff from the brewery and his attempt to find a new career, and which uses the medieval jousting world as its backdrop in a way that's both absurd and somehow completely believable. Peter in period costume, charging other period costumed men on horseback, taking this absolutely seriously while everything around him processes it as the extended joke it clearly is a perfect image of who Peter was in these early seasons. Completely committed to whatever he was doing, regardless of how that thing looked from outside. The season also contains the episode Death Lives, which is one of the show's most interesting formal experiments. Death the Grim Reaper, as a character, visits Peter on his birthday, and the episode uses Death's visit to frame a series of reflections on Peter's life and marriage that are actually quite moving. Death is a character the show had already established in earlier episodes, played with a kind of bored practicality that suggests someone doing an eternal job with a very long history behind it. He's not malevolent. He's not comic. He's just doing what needs to be done. And his presence forces Peter into a kind of honesty about his life that Peter rarely achieves without external pressure. The episode deals with a marriage at a particular moment, not in crisis, exactly, but in the specific kind of settled routine that can start to feel like invisibility, and it does so with enough warmth and enough honesty that it lands in a way that pure comedy episodes can't quite reach. Peter loves Lois. This is established in the episode not through declaration but through what Peter does when he's given the opportunity to show it. He fights for her in the specific way that Peter fights for things. Imperfectly, excessively, without much strategic sense, but with total sincerity. The season finale, which precedes the show's first cancellation, has the quality of something that didn't know it was a finale. It wasn't written as an ending. There was no sense, in the production of that episode, that the show was about to be canceled and that this would be the last new Family Guy for 3 years. And so the episode exists without the valedictory quality that planned finales have, without the careful summing up and the character moments and the sense that this is a goodbye. It's just another episode, which, in a way, makes the cancellation feel more abrupt in retrospect, not just to the audience but to the show itself. Section 15. The Return Season 4's Big Moments and What They Meant. When Family Guy returned in 2005, the network treated it as an event. Fox placed the revival within the Animation Domination Sunday block alongside The Simpsons and King of the Hill, and it premiered with the explicit expectation that people who had been watching the show on Adult Swim reruns and buying the DVD sets were going to show up in numbers that justified the decision to bring it back. And they did. Season 4's premiere drew audiences that validated the entire resurrection. But what was on the screen in Season 4? What did the show that came back look like compared to the show that had left? The Season 4, and it follows Peter and Lois on a second honeymoon that goes completely sideways in ways that involve the pursuit of Mel Gibson across a series of increasingly strange settings. The episode has the hyperactive quality of something trying to demonstrate its own existence, trying to prove that it still has what made it great. There are cutaways, there are elaborate set pieces, there are jokes that land and some that don't. And there's a version of Peter and Lois that is recognizable but slightly different from the versions that left in 2002. The cutaways in Season 4, as discussed earlier, are longer and more frequent than they were in the original 3 seasons. This is the first season where the ratio starts to shift, where the plot feels like it exists to connect cutaways rather than the cutaways existing to enhance the plot. It's not extreme yet. The stories still have real structure. The character dynamics still work, but the tendency is there, visible if you're looking for it. Season 4 also gives us Don't Make Me Over, which is the episode where Meg gets a makeover and briefly becomes attractive by the show's standards, and the comedy of the episode is built around how differently people treat Meg when she looks conventionally appealing. The episode is doing something potentially interesting about the relationship between appearance and social treatment, but it doesn't quite commit to the implications of what it's observing. Meg becomes beautiful. People are nice to her. This lasts for 1 episode, and then everything returns to normal. The show notes that appearance-based treatment is unfair without doing anything with the observation beyond noting it. The episode Petarded from Season 4 is one of the more divisive episodes the show produced in this era. Peter takes an IQ test as part of a game and scores results that put him in a range, suggesting significant intellectual impairment. He then uses this result as leverage, claiming accommodation rights, demanding exemptions from various social expectations, while the episode tries to walk a line between satirizing how people use diagnoses as social cover and treating the underlying subject with appropriate seriousness. The episode doesn't quite succeed at either goal, but the attempt is interesting and there are moments in it that work well. The episode Blind Ambition gives us the first full giant chicken fight, and its arrival in the middle of an otherwise conventionally structured episode is exactly as disorienting and wonderful as it should be. Nothing in the episode has prepared you for a 6-minute action sequence between Peter and a giant chicken. Nothing in the episode's logic requires it. And yet it happens. With the full production resources of the show behind it, the fight choreographed and executed with genuine craftsmanship. It's a set piece in the traditional action movie sense, and its placement in a domestic comedy is the entire joke. The season also contains Jungle Love, in which Chris goes to South America and gets involved in the complex social dynamics of a village, becoming a figure of some importance in the local hierarchy in ways that confuse and eventually concern his family. The episode is a surprisingly sustained character study for Chris, who is often underused. Chris in the village setting is allowed to be something the Griffin household rarely lets him be: capable. He makes decisions, he navigates. He has relationships that are genuinely affecting. And then he comes home because that's what these episodes do, and the Chris who returns is indistinguishable from the Chris who left. Stewie B. Good, Bango was his name. Oh, and Stu and Stewie's excellent adventure form a trilogy at the end of Season 4 that was released as a direct-to-video movie called Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story. We've discussed the future Stewie premise already, but it's worth noting how ambitiously the trilogy stretches the concept of what Stewie can do when the story is built entirely around him. The future sequences in particular give Seth MacFarlane the opportunity to voice multiple versions of Stewie across different ages and life stages, and the result is one of the show's most interesting extended explorations of a single character. Section 16. The musical tradition songs the show actually got right. One thing that doesn't get enough credit in discussions of Family Guy is the show's genuine tradition of musical numbers. The Road to episodes have their musical moments, but the musical thread runs through the entire show in ways that are often surprising in their quality. The show's most celebrated song is probably You've Got a Lot to See, which appears in the episode Brian in Love and is sung by Brian to a foster child he's taking on a tour of the world's possibilities. The song is a Broadway-style number that functions as a genuine emotional expression. Brian genuinely means what he's singing, and the hope in it is real, and the performance sells it in a way that catches you off guard. The show isn't usually this earnest, but in this moment with this song it earns the earnestness. Sheepopy, from the episode Patriot Games in Season 4, is another landmark. The song is borrowed from The Music Man. It's an actual show tune, but the Family Guy version, with Peter performing it at a football game, escalates from a normal musical number into something increasingly elaborate until it has consumed the entire stadium and everyone in it. The joke is the escalation, but the performance underneath the joke is genuinely accomplished, and MacFarlane's vocal performance is strong enough that the entertainment value isn't just comedic. The Conway Twitty gags, which consist of the show cutting to an extended, unedited performance of actual Conway Twitty performing actual Conway Twitty songs, are a different kind of musical element. They're less about the quality of the music than about what the choice represents. The show's willingness to simply stop being a show for a few minutes and let something else exist in its space. The first time it happened, it was surprising enough to be funny. The subsequent times were genuinely divisive, with some viewers finding the commitment increasingly funny and others finding it increasingly frustrating. But as a concept, as a formal experiment in what a television episode is allowed to do with its runtime, it's more interesting than it usually gets credit for. Road to Rhode Island's closing number is set to the melody of the classic Bob Hope and Bing Crosby Road to Morocco, and the lyrics MacFarlane wrote for it are good enough that the song works independently of its context. It's a song about an unlikely friendship between two completely different beings, and the specific things it says about what makes Brian and Stewie work together are both funny and accurate. The episode Brian Sings and Swings, from Season 4, introduces Frank Sinatra Jr. as a guest star and builds an entire subplot around Brian joining a Rat Pack-style vocal group. Brian's singing voice in this episode is handled as a real thing. He's actually good. The episode posits, and his comfort in that world, surrounded by music and performance and an aesthetic that suits his sense of himself, is one of the most quietly satisfying character moments in the season. The My Drunken Irish Dad song, which appears in a musical number that became one of the show's most remembered pieces of comedy songwriting, works because it hits on exactly the right specific observations about a very particular cultural phenomenon, the performed Irishness of certain St. Patrick's Day traditions, without being cruel about it. The song is genuinely funny, and also, in the way of good comedy writing about cultural specificity, kind of affectionate. The Broadway-style numbers that appear occasionally throughout the show's run, especially in the Road to episodes, have consistently been among the show's highest quality creative output. MacFarlane is a genuine singer with real vocal talent, and the show has always known how to showcase this in ways that don't feel like vanity projects. The songs serve the stories. The performances serve the characters, and the best of them linger in a way that pure joke content doesn't. Section 17. The show's relationship with Rhode Island and its fictional geography. There's something worth considering about the setting of Family Guy that often gets overlooked in favor of the more dramatic elements of the show's content. The show is set in Rhode Island, specifically in the fictional town that gives the Griffins' neighborhood its name, and this setting is not incidental. It's built into the show's identity in ways that are both structural and emotional. Rhode Island is the smallest state in the United States. It has a particular culture, a combination of New England reserve and Italian-American warmth, with a history of manufacturing and fishing, and a class structure that has layers the show occasionally taps into. Lois comes from old money. Peter comes from working-class Irish-American background. Their marriage crosses a class divide, and the show acknowledges this in the episodes that deal with Lois's parents and her upbringing in Newport, where the Carter family represents a version of American wealth that has very little to do with the world Peter inhabits. Carter Pewterschmidt, Lois's father, is one of the show's most consistently funny recurring characters precisely because he represents the very far end of the class spectrum from Peter. He's wealthy in the old-fashioned, slightly absurd way that only very old American wealth is, with properties and clubs and connections, and a casual contempt for people who haven't inherited the right circumstances, and his relationship with Peter is defined entirely by this gap. Carter doesn't hate Peter. He simply cannot quite comprehend that Peter exists in the way he does, doing the things he does, surviving the situations he creates. It's the bafflement of someone looking at a different species through glass. The geography of Spooner Street itself is a surprisingly consistent part of the show's world. The Griffins at number 31, the Swansons next door, Quagmire across the street, and the Browns further along the block. This is a physical arrangement that the show has maintained with reasonable consistency, and the specific character of the street feels like a genuine place. Modest houses. Modest yards. The kind of neighborhood where people know each other's business whether they want to or not, where summer evenings involve being able to hear what's happening in adjacent backyards, where a family like the Griffins could have the adventures they have without it seeming completely implausible, because the neighborhood is small enough for it all to feel contained. The Drunken Clam is close enough to walk to, at least in some episodes, and the walk there is the walk of four men who know where they're going without having to discuss it, who have done this enough times that the route is muscle memory. There's a specific pleasure in this routine that the show understands the pleasure of a place you always go, with people who always go there too, where your order is known before you place it. The ocean is nearby, in the vague geography of the show's Rhode Island. It shows up occasionally, in beach episodes and boat episodes, and it gives the world of the show an edge, a horizon, a sense that there's more beyond what the camera usually shows. The Griffins live on the coast of a small state, in a modest house, in the middle of a life that is nothing special from the outside. And the show has always understood that this ordinariness is the foundation for everything extraordinary that happens within it. Section 18. The side characters who made the world feel real. Beyond the core cast of the Griffin family and the immediate neighbor group, Family Guy built a world populated by recurring characters who gave the show's universe a sense of being genuinely lived in. These aren't just background figures, they're people with their own histories, their own qualities, their own moments of being the center of something. Tom Tucker, the news anchor, is one of the show's most perfectly observed comedy figures. He's the local TV news anchor in the way that local TV news anchors occupy a very specific register of American life, important within their community, possessed of a dignity built entirely on the conventions of their format, and slightly absurd when removed from that format and placed in any real human situation. Tom Tucker takes his anchor status extremely seriously. The show treats this seriousness as comedy, but it's generous comedy. It understands that the self-importance isn't vanity exactly, It's more like the professional demeanor of someone whose job requires the maintenance of a certain kind of authority. Diane Simmons, Tom's co-anchor for much of the show's run, is a character who exists for a long time in a supporting role before being given a showcase in the episode And Then There Were Fewer, a murder mystery episode from season 9 that takes place at a dinner party and kills off several characters including Diane herself. It's one of the show's most formally ambitious episodes, a genuine whodunit in the classic mystery tradition, with all the structural requirements of that tradition honored, and Diane's role in it reveals something about her character that years of co-anchor appearances hadn't fully developed. She has depth, she has grievances, she has made choices and lived with them, and the episode's conclusion puts her in a position that gives the character a genuine tragic arc. Mayor Adam West, voiced by the actual Adam West, who had played Batman in the 1960s television series, is another of the show's perfect recurring figures. He occupies the office of mayor of the town with a serenity that suggests he doesn't quite understand what the job entails, making decisions by criteria that are entirely personal and that have no relationship to municipal governance. His episodes tend to involve the town being threatened or harmed by something that he either doesn't notice or notices and responds to in a way that makes things worse. And yet he has the confidence of someone who has no doubt about his authority, and that confidence is one of the most consistent comedy notes in the show. The greased-up deaf guy appears periodically throughout the show's run, usually in crowd scenes or in the background of something, and his presence is always the same: a man covered in grease, running away from anyone who tries to catch him, unhearable to commands because of his deafness. He was first introduced in the Y2K episode and has never been explained beyond those basic facts. He is a running joke in the most literal sense, a figure who runs, who appears in the background of the show's world, who adds a specific note to the texture of the community the show has built. The news team that occasionally appears beyond Tom Tucker, the meteorologist, the sports reporter, the correspondence gives the news segments their own small world of absurdist hierarchies and professional tensions. The show parodies local television news with genuine affection for the specific weirdness of the format, and the characters who populate it are more consistent than you might expect from what are essentially extended background gags. Consuela, the recurring cleaning lady, is a character who exists entirely in the comedy of a single repeated interaction. She always wants more lemon pledge, and she always says so. And the interaction never varies, but who has been used occasionally in episodes that give her a moment of genuine character presence beyond the repeated bit. She's part of the world in a way that makes the world feel more populated. Neil Goldman, who has feelings for Meg and has expressed them with a consistency that the show treats as evidence of his own particular kind of oblivious optimism, is one of the show's more sympathetically drawn minor characters. He's not cool. He's not particularly self-aware about how he comes across, but his feelings for Meg are genuine, and in a show that spends a great deal of time making Meg the target of contempt, having a character who actually likes her, who finds her genuinely appealing, who pursues her with real if misdirected effort, is a small counterweight that matters. Herbert the elderly man is a character the show treated differently in different eras. In early appearances, he's a creepy presence in the neighborhood whose attentions toward Chris are the object of dark comedy. The show didn't always handle his presence thoughtfully, and the comedy around him aged poorly in ways the production team eventually acknowledged. But there are episodes in the later seasons where Herbert is given a more dimensional treatment, including an episode about his past that gives him a genuine backstory and a moment of emotional weight that retroactively adds complexity to a character who had mostly been a single note. Section 19. The funniest individual moments in the show's history. There's a category of Family Guy memory that lives somewhere separate from episode plots and character arcs, the individual moments, the specific seconds within specific scenes, that people remember with perfect clarity years after watching. The moment the scene changed, when a joke landed in a way that made you laugh in a completely involuntary way, without warning, harder than you expected to. The scene where Stewie is at the top of the stairs, in the early seasons, working through the accumulated frustrations of an evening while Lois remains cheerfully unaware. He has a plan. The plan involves something technical. The technical element requires him to speak directly to Lois, and he does so, in elaborate and threatening detail, while Lois hears him make the sounds of a baby. The gap between what Stewie is expressing and what Lois receives is perfectly sustained across the scene, and the moment when Stewie realizes yet again that his words are not penetrating in the way he intends and processes this, with the specific kind of outraged disbelief that only a genius who cannot make themselves understood can fully achieve is one of the show's most consistently funny, repeated moments. The scene where Peter explains why he doesn't like a film or a piece of art or a public figure, and the explanation is delivered with the full rhetorical weight of someone who has given the matter enormous thought, in terms that reveal he has given it no thought at all, is another recurring comedic device that works almost every time the show deploys it. Peter's certainty in his wrong positions is the key. He's not uncertain about any of them, and the certainty is where the comedy lives. The scene in Road to Rhode Island where Brian and Stewie are on a train, in the dark, and the song begins, is one of the most recalled moments in any of the Road 2 episodes. Not because anything dramatic happens, they're just on a train, but because the transition into the song is so natural and the performance is so confident that it briefly transforms what has been a comedy episode into something that feels more like a genuine musical. The scene in the Brian and Stewie Vault episode where Brian reveals the gun and what it means is recalled not as a funny scene, but as a significant one. The show doesn't undercut it. The beats that surround it are quiet and serious, and then Stewie responds not with a joke but with the declaration that Brian's existence matters to him. It's television that trusts its audience to sit with something for a few seconds without being rescued by comedy. The first appearance of the chicken fight the moment when Peter and Ernie catch each other's eye and everything else in the episode pauses while the two of them silently agree to throw themselves at each other with maximum force has a quality that subsequent chicken fights could never quite reproduce, which is the quality of complete surprise. You don't know this is coming, and then it's here. And it keeps going, in directions that keep escalating. And the commitment of the show to this escalation is the entire joke in the most satisfying way. The scene in Da Boom, where Peter, having prepared for the end of civilization with great care and at some expense, steps out of his shelter to find that civilization has in fact ended, and his expression is not horror, but a kind of vindicated peace. The look of someone who was right about something for once, and is taking a private moment to acknowledge it, is one of Seth MacFarlane's best pure acting. Performances in the show? Section 20. The animation style changes and what they did to the show's feel. Animation is storytelling. This is a thing that seems obvious when stated, but that gets underemphasized in discussions of animated television, where the writing and the voice performances tend to get most of the analytical attention. But the way a character looks when they make an expression, the speed at which a physical joke moves, the weight that the animation gives to bodies in space, all of this affects the comedy in ways that are fundamental rather than incidental. Family Guy's animation has gone through several distinct phases over its run, and the differences between them explain something important about why the show felt different in different eras. The original 3 seasons were animated by Film Roman, and then Rough Draft Studios handled seasons 2 and 3. The work these studios produced had a specific quality that fans have consistently described as more alive and more expressive than what came later. The characters moved with a loose, slightly unpredictable energy. Peter's physical comedy had impact to it. When he fell, you felt the fall. When Stewie made a facial expression, the expression had multiple layers, like a face that was actually processing something in real time. The animation was rougher in the technical sense, less polished, with occasional inconsistencies, but roughness and aliveness are often the same thing in hand-drawn animation. The revival seasons brought cleaner animation. The outlines thickened. The movements became more predictable and more controlled. The polish increased in a way that made the show look more professional, but also made it look more mechanical. This wasn't purely the fault of any individual studio. Animation was changing broadly during this period, with digital tools replacing traditional hand-drawn methods in ways that affected how everything from major studio films to television cartoons looked and moved. But the effect on Family Guy was notable. The scenes that benefited most from the original animation style were the physical comedy scenes, the chicken fights, the elaborate slapstick, the moments where Peter's body was required to do something genuinely surprising. In the original animation, these moments had a quality of actual consequence. The bodies seemed to have weight, and weight meant that impacts felt real, and reality made the comedy more satisfying. In the cleaner, smoother later animation, the same kinds of scenes sometimes felt lighter, less impactful, more like what was happening to cartoon figures rather than what was happening to characters. The show's color palette also changed over time in ways that affected its atmosphere. The original seasons had a somewhat muted, lived-in quality to their color. The Griffin house was warm but not bright. The neighborhood had the slightly faded quality of a place that exists in weather, rather than in the kind of perpetual pleasant light that some animated shows use. Later seasons moved toward brighter, more saturated colors that looked cleaner and more modern, but that also had less of the specific texture of the original world. These are small things. They matter in the aggregate more than any single instance of them would suggest. The show in Season 1 looked like something that existed in a real place. The show in Season 20 looked like something that existed in an animation. Section 21. The guest stars' famous voices in the Griffin House. Family Guy's use of celebrity guest voices is one of the show's most reliable and consistent creative strategies. From the very first episode, which featured a cameo from Jerry Seinfeld, playing the jester that Peter hires with his welfare check, the show has understood that the right celebrity in the right role could produce comedy that came from the gap between who the person is in real life and what they're being asked to do in the show. The guest star philosophy of Family Guy has always been slightly different from the guest star philosophy of shows like The Simpsons. The Simpsons typically gave its guest stars roles that had some relationship to their public persona, but that also allowed them to do something actorly, to inhabit a character rather than just play themselves. Family Guy often did the same, but also frequently used celebrities in completely unexpected roles that had nothing to do with their real-world identity, casting them against type in ways that generated comedy from pure incongruity. Adam West, who we've already discussed in the context of Mayor Adam West, is the most enduring example of a celebrity whose presence in the show produced something that became genuinely iconic. Adam West, playing the mayor of a fictional town with the same calm authority he brought to playing Batman, but applied to civic matters of wildly varying importance, is a comedy idea that worked so consistently over so many appearances that the character outlasted the joke it was originally based on and became something else entirely, a genuine character who happened to be played by a celebrity, rather than a celebrity playing a version of their celebrity. James Woods appeared in an episode called Peter's Got Woods, which deployed a variation on the actor's real-world reputation for intensity and sometimes unpredictable behavior in a way that required the actual James Woods to be willing to engage with that reputation directly. The episode is one of the show's better celebrity vehicle episodes because it uses the celebrity's presence not just for recognition but for something that requires the celebrity to be in on the joke about themselves. Carrie Fisher voiced the character of Angela, Peter's boss at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, for many seasons. The casting is interesting because it places a figure of significant cultural meaning, Fisher's most famous role being one of the defining images of popular cinema in a completely ordinary corporate context, playing a middle manager with a complicated relationship with her employees. Angela had enough screen time over enough episodes to develop into a genuine character, and Fisher's vocal performance gave her a specific quality of weary authority that was different from what any other casting choice would have produced. Patrick Stewart has appeared in the show in multiple roles, most consistently as the voice of Susie Swanson, Joe, and Bonnie's infant daughter, whose inner life is expressed by the sort of polished, Shakespearean vocal delivery that only Patrick Stewart can provide. The gap between Susie's appearance, a baby, in baby clothes, doing baby things, and the voice coming out of her is the entire joke, and it works because Stewart is completely committed to it. The episode Quagmire and Meg, which is a later season episode, brought in a guest star to play a music producer who discovers Meg and attempts to reshape her into a commercial product, and the episode used the celebrity presence to do something interesting, to comment on the music industry's relationship to young female performers, in a way that was both comedic and, given what would come out about various industry figures in subsequent years, somewhat prescient. Section 22. What the show got right that nothing else did. There's a case to be made, and it's a case that the show's most devoted fans make regularly, that, at its peak, Family Guy was doing something in animated television that nobody else was doing, and that this specific thing has never quite been replicated. The thing it was doing was the combination of genuine emotional warmth with complete tonal freedom. The show could be sweet and then immediately be completely outrageous, and the transition between those modes was so fluid that the two qualities seemed not to be in tension but to be different expressions of the same sensibility. The warmth didn't make the outrageousness less effective. The outrageousness didn't undercut the warmth. They were both real, both present, both coming from the same place. This combination is harder to achieve than it sounds. Shows that are warm tend to protect that warmth by moderating the outrageousness. Shows that are willing to be outrageous tend to use the outrageousness to maintain distance from anything that might require emotional investment. The early Family Guy didn't make that trade-off. It was willing to be genuinely affecting and genuinely shocking in the same episode, sometimes in the same scene, and the result was a show that felt fully alive in a way that more carefully calibrated shows don't. The Simpsons, which remains the gold standard for animated family comedies, achieves something similar but through a different mechanism. The Simpsons earns its emotional moments by building them carefully within episodes that have clear narrative architecture. The jokes in The Simpsons tend to serve the story rather than interrupt it. Family Guy in its best episodes was doing something more anarchic. The jokes interrupted the story constantly, and the story kept reassembling itself around the interruptions, and the result had an energy that was more chaotic but also more exciting. South Park, which created the genre of animated comedy that comments on current events in real time, does something different. Again, it's primarily interested in ideas rather than characters, in what a situation means rather than in who the people in the situation are. Family Guy has never been primarily interested in ideas. It has always been primarily interested in these specific people in this specific world, and the ideas emerge from watching these people fail to understand themselves and each other in specifically human ways. The show that comes closest to what early Family Guy was doing is probably Arrested Development, a live-action show, not animation, which also combined genuine structural sophistication with willingness to commit to absurdity, and which also placed real emotional weight on characters who were doing deeply foolish things. Both shows trusted their audience to hold comedy and feeling at the same time, which is a form of trust that most television doesn't extend to its viewers. What Family Guy got right that made it special was the sense that the people in it were real to the show's creators, that their lives and feelings and relationships mattered to the people making the show, and that the comedy was coming from care rather than from contempt. That sense that the creators liked their characters, even the difficult ones, even the ones doing genuinely terrible things, gave the show a quality that outlasted many specific jokes. You can forget a punchline and still carry the feeling of a show that made you feel like you were in on something. Section 23. A Long Night on Spooner Street. Final thoughts before sleep. We've come a long way together tonight. From that very first episode in January of 1999, from Peter sitting in his kitchen the morning after a stag party, with the residue of 37 beers still somewhere in his system, about to go to work and fall asleep and set in motion the first of several 100,000 chain reactions that would define the next quarter century of animated television, to the most recent seasons, which find the family still occupying the same address, still having adventures that no real family could survive, still somehow together at the end of every episode despite everything. There's a specific comfort in long-running shows. Not in every long-running show, some shows wear out their welcome quickly, and the familiar comfort becomes something closer to obligation, but in the ones that have genuinely populated their own world, that have built a place you can visit and recognize and feel at home in regardless of how long you've been away. Family Guy, for all its inconsistencies and all its periods of decline and all the debates that have surrounded it over the years, is one of those shows. The house on Spooner Street is a real place, in the way that imaginary places are real. It exists in a specific geography of the imagination, with specific sounds and specific light and specific rhythms that you know, even if you've never been there, because you've been there in the way that television allows you to be somewhere you've never been. Peter is probably in the living room right now, in this imagined present, watching something on television and almost certainly going to have a terrible idea within the next few minutes. Lois is probably finishing something in the kitchen, or playing piano in the other room, or having a conversation with someone that Peter will interrupt with the terrible idea. Brian has a glass of something and is probably reading, or thinking about the novel he's going to write someday. Stewie is in his room. Whatever he's building in his room is probably dangerous. Meg is somewhere in the house, existing in the specific way that Meg exists, present but not quite seen, part of everything that happens but acknowledged only occasionally. Chris is in his room with his art. The house is full of people who love each other in ways they can't always express, and who frustrate each other in ways they express constantly. And down the street, the Drunken Clam is still open. The lights are on. There are 4 usual seats at a specific spot in the bar that will remain unoccupied until the next time the 4 men who always sit in them come through the door, which will be soon. It's always soon. That's what a regular place is. It's always soon. Outside, the Rhode Island night is the Rhode Island night. Whatever season the show is currently in, whatever episode is playing on the television of your imagination, the world out there is doing what the world does. Continuing. The ocean is somewhere nearby, doing what oceans do. The stars are up, if the clouds will permit it. The neighborhood is quiet in the specific way that a neighborhood where the Griffins live is never quite fully quiet, where some distant evidence of their existence is always just barely audible. The chicken fight will happen again. It always does. Stewie is always planning something. Brian is always almost finishing the novel. Peter is always about to have a terrible idea that will turn into something extraordinary. And Lois is always there, at the center of all of it, holding things together with a patience that is mostly genuine and occasionally fraying at exactly the edges where patience reasonably frays. This is the world of Spooner Street, and it'll be here when you wake up. Section 24. The episodes that redefined what a cartoon could do. There's a specific stretch of Family Guy episodes that challenged the assumptions television audiences had built about what an animated comedy was supposed to be. Not what animated comedies could theoretically be, people had been theorizing about that since the medium was invented, but what they actually were, week after week, in the experience of watching one. The assumption, going into the late 1990s and early 2000s, was fairly settled. An animated comedy was a show that told contained stories in 22 minutes. The characters would have a problem. The problem would produce comedy. The problem would resolve. There might be a lesson learned, or there might not, but either way, the status quo would be restored and the next episode would begin from the same baseline. This was the grammar of the form, and most animated shows honored it without question. Family Guy honored it too, most of the time. But the show was always testing the edges of what it was allowed to do, and occasionally it found a genuinely new way to use the form that produced something surprising. The episode Peter Griffin, Husband, Father, Brother, from Season 4 is one of the earlier examples of this. In it, Peter discovers during a genealogy project that the Griffin family may have had enslaved ancestors in their history, that somewhere in the family tree is a lineage that passes through the antebellum American South in ways that carry significant historical and moral weight. The episode uses this discovery to force Peter into a real engagement with American history, specifically with the history of slavery and its implications, and does so in a way that neither minimizes the subject nor handles it with the kind of solemn reverence that would make it feel out of place in the show's usual register. The episode works because it's genuinely trying to figure something out. Peter is confused. He doesn't know how to hold this information, how to integrate it into his understanding of who he is. And his confusion is legitimate. This is genuinely hard material, not because the moral stakes are unclear, but because the relationship between a person in the present and the history their family carries is genuinely complicated, and the show engages with that complication honestly. The episode Partial Terms of Endearment from Season 8 was banned from airing in the United States when it was initially produced. It deals with surrogacy and reproductive rights, following Lois as she agrees to be a surrogate for a couple who cannot have children biologically. The episode is handled with more nuance than either its subject or the show's reputation would lead you to expect. The emotional stakes of the surrogacy, the bond that develops, the complications that arise, the question of what happens when the situation changes in ways nobody anticipated are treated as real human stakes rather than as setups for jokes. The episode Never Farts in Bed from Season 12 is a smaller-scale example of the same phenomenon. A Family Guy episode that commits fully to character over comedy in a way that catches you off guard. It follows Peter trying to do something kind for Lois genuinely, without self-interest, just because he loves her and wants to show it, and the comedy that arises is softer than usual, the kind that comes from watching someone who isn't good at tenderness try to be tender anyway. Peter is not smooth. He is not articulate about his feelings. But the feelings themselves are real, and the episode locates something sweet in his imperfect attempts to express them. The episode Big Man on Hippocampus from Season 8 is one of the show's most extended and most successful explorations of what happens when one of the core relationship dynamics of the show is fundamentally disrupted. Peter loses his memory in an accident and no longer remembers anything about his life, including his marriage to Lois. He starts fresh, meeting his family as strangers, and the episode tracks what happens when a person is essentially erased and another person who loves them has to figure out what to do with that. Lois has to decide whether to wait for Peter to recover his memories or to rebuild a relationship with this new Peter who is present and engaging, but who doesn't carry any of their history. The episode doesn't take the easy route of having Peter's memory return quickly. It commits to the uncertainty, to the genuinely uncomfortable experience of being in a relationship with someone who doesn't remember choosing you. And the result is one of the most affecting things the show ever did with Peter and Lois's marriage. Section 25. The Mythology of Pawtucket, Patriot Ale, and the Drunken Clam. Some of Family Guy's most consistent world-building happens in spaces that the show treats as completely ordinary. The bar where Peter and his friends spend time, the brewery where Peter works, the social rituals that structure their days. These spaces don't carry the weight of the show's big concept episodes, but they accumulate into something that makes the world of the show feel genuinely inhabited. The Pawtucket Patriot Brewery is Peter's workplace for most of the show's run, and the show uses it in ways that paint a specific picture of what working a blue-collar job in a mid-sized New England city looks like. Peter has co-workers who have their own lives, their own problems, their own histories with each other. He has a boss first, Mr. Weed, who appears in the very first episode and eventually dies in a genuinely surprising scene. Then Angela, voiced by Carrie Fisher, who occupies the role for many seasons afterward. The workplace has politics and hierarchies and the specific texture of a place where people spend large portions of their lives doing something they didn't particularly choose, but that has become the structure around which their real lives are organized. The beer itself, Pawtucket Patriot Ale, is referenced throughout the show as a product with a specific identity, a New England regional brew with the slightly overconfident branding of something that considers itself more important than it probably is. The show occasionally does things with the brewery and the beer that turn into actual storylines. An episode about the brewery's history, an episode about a rival beer, an episode about a marketing campaign that goes wrong in the ways that marketing campaigns in Family Guy always go wrong. The Drunken Clam, as a physical space, has been established over 25 years of episodes with more precision than most fictional bars in television. The regular seats, the bartender, Horace, who for many seasons provides a baseline of stability. He's always there, always behind the bar, always functioning as the backdrop against which Peter and his friends' conversations happen. When Horace dies in a later season and is replaced, the change feels significant in a way that reflects how much his consistent presence had become part of what the bar meant. The conversations in the Drunken Clam have their own rhythm. The four men, Peter, Joe, Quagmire, Cleveland, and later variations on this configuration after Cleveland leaves for his spin-off talk in circles, returning to the same subjects, the same observations about their lives, the same gentle complaints about wives and work and the general state of things. There's a quality to these scenes, when they're handled well, that feels deeply honest about male friendship. The way that certain things are never directly addressed but are always present. The way that companionship gets expressed through the willingness to show up rather than through the things that get said. Peter's relationship with beer specifically is worth examining because it's handled with more complexity than a simple character trait would require. He loves beer. This is established in the first episode and never varies. But the love of beer isn't depicted purely as a comedy beat. There are episodes where it's connected to something more complicated, where the drinking is doing something beyond just being something Peter does. The show knows this without ever making it explicit, and that knowing without making explicit is part of what gives the character his particular texture. The social geography of the neighborhood around the Drunken Clam, the places that become shorthand references, the routes between them, the other establishments that make up the world gives the show a physical sense that most animated comedies don't develop. You know where things are in relation to each other. You have a sense of how long it takes to get from one place to another, of what's visible from which angles, of the way the neighborhood smells and sounds at different times of day. This is the accumulation of 100 small details across hundreds of episodes, and it creates something that functions like a sense of place, even though the place is entirely invented. Section 26. The song Stewie sang, a musical inventory. Stewie Griffin's musical moments deserve their own extended consideration because they represent something unusual in the landscape of animated comedy. A recurring character who is also a genuinely accomplished musical theater performer, whose songs function both as comedy and as real music that stands on its own terms. McFarlane's vocal range is extensive, and the Stewie voice is capable of things that most animated character voices aren't. It has the flexibility to handle real singing, to sustain notes, to navigate the demands of theatrical musical performance with the craft that comes from someone who grew up listening to and studying the Great American Songbook and its theatrical equivalents. The episode I Never Met the Dead Man, from Season 1, features Stewie in what might be his first full musical number. And even this early, the quality of the performance is notable. The Stewie voice in song is a specific instrument. It carries the character's grandiosity and theatricality, but adds a warmth that the speaking voice doesn't always have, as if singing is where Stewie is most fully himself. The song All I Really Need Is the Boy, which appears in the bonus content from the Brian and Stewie Vault episode, is a riff on the classic You've Got to Pick a Pocket or Two from Oliver. And McFarlane performs it with the specific kind of theatrical commitment that distinguishes a real vocal performance from an impression of a vocal performance. Stewie means the song. The menace in it is real, and so is the delight. The It's a Wonderful Day for Pie sequence from Road to Rhode Island, where Lois leads the family in an idyllic domestic musical number that Brian watches from outside the window before the camera pulls back to reveal the context that makes the idyll both sweet and complicated, uses the musical form in exactly the right way. To say something about the distance between how things look from outside and what they feel like from inside. The musical moments in the North Pole episode, the whole episode has a specific musical register, warmer and more deliberate than the show's usual pace, include a song about Christmas spirit that works as a genuine Christmas song rather than a parody of one. The show playing something straight in a musical context is rarer than its musical parodies, and the episodes that do it reveal how much genuine craft is available to the show when it chooses to deploy it. Section 27. Sleep and the Quiet After the Credits. The credits of a Family Guy episode run over a simple melody that has become, for anyone who has watched the show extensively, a kind of auditory signal. It's over. The adventure is concluded. Whatever chaos has just transpired has reached its temporary equilibrium, and here is a brief moment of music before the next thing begins. There's something in the consistency of that signal, in any long-running show's consistent end-of-episode signal, that becomes comforting over time in ways that have nothing to do with the content of what preceded it. It's the sound of resolution. It's the confirmation that things do, eventually, end, and that endings are followable by more episodes, by more beginnings, by the renewable quality of a world that continues to exist across the commercial break. Family Guy has been resolving itself and beginning again for 25 years. The format that seemed fresh in 1999, that seemed tired by the mid-2010s, that adapted and evolved in ways nobody fully predicted, is still doing what it's always done, assembling a family in a house, giving them a situation, following the situation through all its consequences, and returning them to something like their starting position before the credits run. This is not a small thing. The ability to keep producing something, to keep making episodes, to keep populating a world, to keep finding new versions of the same fundamental comedy across a quarter-century of changing culture and changing audience expectations and changing production conditions is genuinely remarkable. Whatever you think of the quality of any particular episode in any particular season, the Griffins are still there, Spooner Street is still there, the Drunken Clam is still pouring, and somewhere in that small fictional Rhode Island town, the next story is already beginning. Peter has already had the idea that will start it, or Stewie has already built the device that will make it necessary, or Brian is already in a situation that will require consequences, or Meg is already somewhere on the margins of the frame, watching everything with clear eyes and saying nothing until the moment when saying something becomes unavoidable. It is a world that has sustained itself on the particular energy of characters who keep surprising each other and keep surprising us, even after all this time, even after everything that's happened. That energy doesn't run out, exactly. It changes form. It finds new expressions. It cycles back through old ideas and finds new angles on them. And you can watch it now if you want to, or you can let it run somewhere in the background of wherever your mind goes when your eyes close and your breathing slows and the day finally releases you from its requirements. Either way, the show will be here. The house will be here. The lights on Spooner Street will be on. Let your breath go slow. Let the weight of the day settle somewhere comfortable. The Griffins are fine. They're always fine in the end, in the specific way that cartoon families are always fine. Ready for the next episode? unchanged in the ways that matter, and slightly changed in all the ways that don't? Exactly as they should be. Section 28. The long friendship between Peter and Brian. The friendship between Peter Griffin and Brian Griffin is one of the most unlikely and also one of the most consistently interesting relationships in the entire show. On paper, it shouldn't work. They have almost nothing in common. Peter is loud, impulsive, unread, and tends to make every situation worse before making it better. Brian is quiet by comparison, reflective, bookish, and has a low tolerance for the kind of chaos that Peter generates naturally and continuously. Peter is the storm. Brian is the person trying to find shelter in the storm and usually failing because the storm follows him everywhere, specifically because he has chosen to remain in proximity to its source. And yet, they are best friends, genuinely, consistently, across every season of the show's run. Regardless of what else has changed in either of their characterizations or in the show around them, the friendship between Peter and Brian holds. They show up for each other. They bail each other out. They sit together in the bar and talk about things they'd never discuss with anyone else in quite the same way. Part of what makes this friendship work is that it's built on genuine mutual recognition rather than on convenience or proximity. Peter finds Brian interesting. He doesn't always understand Brian, doesn't always follow what Brian is talking about, frequently misses the point of something Brian says by such a wide margin that Brian has to choose between explaining it and just letting it go. But he finds Brian interesting anyway, in the specific way that a person without a great deal of inner life can find someone with a great deal of inner life fascinating, like watching someone read a book in a language you don't speak, being drawn to the quality of their attention even without access to what they're attending to. Brian finds Peter grounding in a way that his own tendency toward overthinking makes necessary. Peter doesn't overthink anything. Peter barely thinks once, let alone twice. And there's a relief, for Brian, in being around someone who is so completely in the present moment, who experiences things directly, without the mediation of all the self-consciousness and self-analysis that Brian brings to everything. Peter is immediate in a way that Brian can't be, and being around that immediacy gives Brian's world a different texture. They also make each other laugh. This is understated in analyses of the friendship, but it's one of its foundations. Peter finds Brian consistently funny in ways that Brian doesn't always find himself funny. Brian finds Peter consistently funny in ways that Peter rarely intends but always produces. And humor, shared between two people who understand each other's particular variety of it, is one of the most durable bonds there is. The episode where Brian gets a pet and Peter becomes unexpectedly involved in its care is one of the smaller-scale explorations of this friendship, but it's one of the most honest about how the friendship actually operates on a day-to-day basis. Brian has his life. Peter respects the shape of Brian's life without always understanding the reasons behind it. And when something in Brian's life requires help, even practical, unglamorous help, Peter is there without needing to be asked twice. The road to episodes are the formal articulation of this friendship, but the friendship also lives in all the spaces between the road to episodes, in the walks to the drunken clam, in the late-night conversations in the kitchen, in the moments where one of them has done something the other thinks is a mistake and says so, directly, and the other one gets defensive and then, later, quieter and more honest. Section 29. The Simpsons comparison and why it matters less than people think. Family Guy existed from almost its first season in the shadow of The Simpsons, the animated family sitcom that had dominated television since 1989, and that had created most of the formal vocabulary that Family Guy then worked with and against. The comparison was unavoidable. It was also, fairly quickly, somewhat unhelpful. The two shows are not doing the same thing. They share a basic format: animated family, fictional American town, episodic comedy, but the sensibility behind each of them is significantly different, and the differences matter more than the similarities in understanding what either show actually is. The Simpsons, at its best, is a show about the specific texture of American life in the late 20th century, its institutional failures, its cultural absurdities, its persistent gap between what the American dream promises and what American reality delivers. The humor in early Simpsons comes from the precision of its observations, from the feeling that the writers have looked very carefully at the world and found the exact right angle from which it looks both funny and true. Family Guy, at its best, is less interested in observation than in invention. It doesn't primarily want to find the comedy in recognizable life. It wants to take recognizable life and push it somewhere that recognizable life doesn't go, to follow premises to extremes that feel inevitable in retrospect but that require imagination to reach. The show is playing a different game, and judging it by the same standards as The Simpsons misses what it's actually trying to do. South Park, the third major pole of the animated adult comedy landscape, is different from both in being primarily interested in arguing about ideas. South Park wants to debate you. It has positions on things, and it's trying to advance those positions through the medium of animated comedy, and the comedy is partly a vehicle for the argument. Family Guy has opinions too, but they're less central to what it's doing. The opinions are ingredients rather than the point. The crossover episode between Family Guy and The Simpsons. The Simpsons Guy from season 13 is the show's own attempt to address the comparison directly, and it does so with more generosity than either show's most competitive fans would have predicted. The episode puts the two families in contact with each other, lets them interact, and uses the interaction to acknowledge what the shows share and what makes them distinct. It doesn't declare a winner. It suggests that both shows have something real to offer to audiences who know how to look for what each one does best. And that's probably right. The comparison matters in the context of understanding Family Guy's history and its reception, because so much of how the show was talked about, especially in the years after its return from cancellation, was organized around whether it was better or worse than The Simpsons. This framing made it hard to see Family Guy clearly on its own terms. A show that's constantly being measured against a different show, by different standards, using criteria developed for the other show, is always going to look like it's falling short. The more useful question is what Family Guy was trying to be, and how well it succeeded at being that thing in the episodes when it was operating at full power. The answer, in those episodes, is very well. Better than almost anything else on television at the time. Doing what it was specifically designed to do, in a way that nobody else was doing it. Section 30. One more night in the neighborhood. There's a version of falling asleep in which you're not quite fully gone, but you're not quite fully here either. The thoughts slow down, they become less sequential. They start making connections that wouldn't hold up in daylight, jumping from one thing to another with a logic that belongs to that specific in-between state, to the country that exists at the border of consciousness and sleep. This is a good state to be in for thinking about Family Guy. The show has always operated partly in a zone where normal rules don't apply, and where the connections between things are more associative than logical. A character says something and the screen cuts to something completely unrelated, and the relationship between the two things is held together by nothing more than the fact that one came right after the other. That's a dream logic. That's the way the mind works when it's not under the obligation to be coherent. Maybe that's why the show has always been something people watch late at night. It fits the mental register of midnight and later of the hours when the strict sequential requirements of daytime have loosened, when you're willing to follow something wherever it goes without asking it to justify every step. The cutaway gag is not a daylight device. It's a device for the relaxed attention, for the mind that is present but not insisting. And so, here we are. Wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is on your clock, you have spent some time tonight in a town that doesn't exist, with a family that doesn't exist, in a bar that doesn't exist, watching people who have never been real do things that could never happen. And somehow that has been worthwhile. Somehow it has occupied the part of the evening that needed occupying, has provided the company that the hour called for. The Griffins don't know you're here. They never do. The whole arrangement is entirely one-directional. You know them, their house, their habits, the specific way Peter laughs when he finds something funny, the specific way Lois looks when she is managing her patients, the specific way Stewie sounds when he's about to announce a plan. They know nothing about you, but they've been here, available to be watched, for 25 years, and the accumulated presence of all those episodes is a kind of gift, even when any individual episode has fallen short of the gift's potential. Let the show run somewhere in the background of your sleep if it wants to. Let the cutaway gags play without you. Let Stewie execute whatever scheme he's currently executing without requiring your supervision. Let Brian read. Let Peter be Peter, in all his imperfect, chaotic, somehow lovable Peterness. And let yourself be wherever you are, at whatever time it is, with the weight of your own day behind you and the quiet of the next few hours ahead. You made it here, that's enough. A final word from the narrator. 27 sections. 25 years of animated television. One fictional Rhode Island town. One house on one fictional street. and a family that has somehow managed to keep existing through cancellations and revivals and creative peaks and valleys, and a whole shifting landscape of American culture moving around them. That's what you've spent your evening with. That's the company you've kept. The show began with a man who drank too many beers at a party and made a series of increasingly impractical decisions. It has produced, in the time since that first episode aired, hundreds of stories in that same world, with those same characters, finding new permutations of the same essential comedy. People who are not quite equipped for the situations they find themselves in, making it through anyway, by some combination of luck and stubbornness and love. You could watch Family Guy forever and not run out of things to notice. The world is deep in the ways that imagined worlds are sometimes deep, with details that accumulate, and references that build on each other, and relationships that develop layers over time that they couldn't have in any single episode alone. It rewards the long view. It rewards the kind of attention that sleep-adjacent watching produces, where you're following the broad strokes and letting the specific details wash past you like music. That's where we leave it for tonight. Broad strokes, slow rhythm, the gentle continuance of a fictional world that will keep being there whenever you want to return to it. This show, in all its imperfect, enduring, genuinely strange glory, has been a companion to a lot of people across a lot of late nights. And that, quietly, counts for something real. Good night, wherever in the world you are. Drop a comment letting us know what time it is and where you're watching from. We love knowing who's out there. And if you haven't subscribed yet, it's completely free. We'll see you in the next one.